please join and rise for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Good evening, everyone. This is the regularly scheduled meeting of the Board of Estimate and Taxation for July 2011. Item 2 now comes before us, non-routine applications. The first one, PZ1, was taken up by the BET HR Committee, and as a result, let me call on the chairman of our HR Committee, Jim Campbell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So PZ1, Planning and Zoning, an additional appropriation, temporary salaries, $23,070, and Social Security associated with that, $1,765. It's for a new permanent part-time administrative staff assistant in the Zoning Enforcement Office. On behalf of the HR Committee, I so move.
It's been moved and seconded. Discussion.
Mr. Chairman.
Please.
So the HR Committee met last Tuesday, the 12th of July. Both P&Z Chairman Don Heller and P&Z Director Diane Fox, who are both here, appeared before the committee. As members can see from the blue sheet and the attached memoranda, P&Z has at this time one part-time administrative staff position to handle Board of Appeals applications and financial transactions for zoning application permits. With the inclusion of zoning staff and functions under P&Z Department authority, new procedures and new zoning permits and applications began in January of this year with a resultant increase in workload. That new workload, it was explained to us at our committee meeting, includes installing the new CityView zoning permit software program to track all zoning and Board of Appeals applications, nuisance complaints, zoning permits for building permits, and certificates of occupancy. The P&Z part-time staff person presently assigned to enter all information for this zoning function, in addition to other duties, has not been able to keep up with the increased workload without a diminution in the office's ability to handle routine functions as quickly and as efficiently as in the past. The committee considered the application and voted 4-0 to approve the requested new part-time position. I should also note that the funding is to start this position in the fourth quarter of the year. So it's a 9-month appropriation from October 1st through the end of the fiscal year.
Let me clarify also on our agenda, it has it for the 10-11 fiscal year. It should be for the 11-12 fiscal year, correct?
Correct.
Peter?
Yes.
Further discussion? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Abstention. 11-0-0. My understanding is that Mr. Kelly will be joining us later, as he had a prior commitment earlier this evening. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
A non-routine application, PD2, now comes before us. That went before our Budget Committee. Its Chairman, Michael Mason.
Good evening, everyone. PD2 is a application from the Police Department to accept a grant, and included with that would be an appropriation for $600,000 for a patrol boat. And on behalf of the Budget Committee, I so move that item.
Second.
Moved by Mr. Mason, second by Mr. Simon. Discussion.
The Budget Committee reviewed this item with the Police Department, First Selectman, Fire Chief. We qualified some questions with the Police Department on some of our concerns and issues ahead of time, which has been circulated as well. We were sent, obviously, the response for that, and obviously you can see there's a very detailed package in our blue sheets. I'll just outline some of the highlights and concerns. The town is concerned that adding another piece of equipment obviously has operational costs, maintenance, hauling, and dredging. With that, upon acceptance of the boat, once the boat is received, the town would be able to apply for an additional grant for up to 3 years of maintenance items that would go along with the boat. Very interesting. Very few grants come along in that fashion. Questions were asked about the ability to store the new boat in the area that we currently have for the Marine Division of the Police Department, which is down near the Island Beach Ferry area. There was a question of where we're going in the future with staffing. The new boat has some operational advantages for terrorist activity and actual additional firefighting capabilities. With that, we went into a discussion with the police department about our current situation where the current police department marine vessels do address issues with fire on the water and public safety. Obviously, their concern is once human life or life is protected, that they're not really concerned with the firefighting aspect of it, and that's been a 40-plus year policy. We went in the package, you'll notice there's some Connecticut general statutes mentioned. We went into the detail on those to see if there were potential strings attached to that. We're assured that obviously there's nothing that would be in keeping there that would be any different than what we currently have. We had a lot of discussion on this, and basically we came down to a series of questions between First Selectman Tessie, Chief Rydberg, and Chief Szynski. I mean, the bottom line question was, do we need this boat? And the answer is no, we do not need this boat. However, it is a $600,000 boat. The hull, the bottom part of it, is equal to the boat that we have. It'll share. The town does have the ability to, after we get this boat, and let me just make sure we're very clear, this grant and appropriation in building the boat, we wouldn't see this boat till the end of the next summer season next year, so this is not something that's happening tomorrow. The police department was asked what the planning would be with their current boats, and obviously it does give them some options and for them to go in the future from there. At the end of it really comes down to an issue of the town of Greenwich is being offered a very high-tech piece of equipment that certainly enhances the services that we offer at what we call no cost to us. So at the end, our opinion was to recommend this to the BET 4-0. If approved here, it'll go to the RTM for acceptance of the grant and the appropriation, and then that process would begin for obtaining a new vessel.
Discussion. Either we have a lot of boaters or we have no boaters. One of the two.
Does discussion include the audience?
It normally does not. Are there people who wish to speak on this item? 1, 2, 3, 4? Is there a fourth? No, there's 3. You're making it worse. We do not normally hold public hearings. All right, we'll allow brief comments. I'll allow the 3 of you time to speak on a limited basis. So if you have some comments, we'll accept them now. I think this is an important enough issue where it's going to go to the RTM for approval. Not that all of our requests don't, but I think for this limited purpose, I'll entertain it unless I hear any objection from the board here. Okay, so I don't know, Mr. Isbranson?
Good afternoon, members of BET. My name is Hans Isbranson. I'm a 58-year resident of Greenwich. I've been a boater for 55 years, and I own a 43-foot powerboat in Greenwich. I am also the chairman of the Marine Committee at Indian Harbor Yacht Club. I am also on I own a marine business, and I am on the 2-term member of the RTM, as well as being Public Works, Town Services, and Parks and Rec. I am speaking to you in opposition to this gift. I wrote an article in November for the Greenwich Time where I opposed this gift, and I explained my points there, and I'm happy to give you a copy of that article. I, like most boaters, like new boats. If I have a boat, I want a bigger boat. If I have a new boat, I want another new boat. I'm sure the town is no different. It's always terrific to get new boats until you have to pay for them. I read Jim Bonney's article. I understand all the reasons why he would like to have this. Most of them are valid. I'm not sure they're essential. We already have 3 boats, and this would be the 4th boat. As mentioned, this is the most number of boats we've ever had, major boats we've ever had. So I don't see that the police department's mission has changed significantly in the 60-odd years that I've lived here. There is the issue of cost, and there's 3 levels of cost. As I expressed in my article, the federal government has no money. They really shouldn't be giving this thing, but that's not our job here, is to worry about federal money. But as taxpayers, you should have that in the back of your mind. This is a boondoggle. Then we get to the state issue. The state has no money. As taxpayers, again, down in Greenwich, that's not our issue, but you're a taxpayer in the state, and once again, we shouldn't be doing that. That comes back down to the town. And I saw the cost estimates, which I think are way undervalued. I have my boat. I had some problems with the engine. I just spent $70,000 on it. I'm not suggesting the town is in the exact same position, but the costs are always more. As a marine operator, typically you have to add 10 to 15% or allow for 10 to 15% of the cost of an item regardless of what it is. I've seen these estimates at $5,000 a year. It just isn't going to happen. The 124 boat has new engines that have to be put in. That's going to cost $110,000. If you amortize that over 10 years, that's $11,000 a year for those engines. I don't see how this boat is going to be any different than those. So I think the cost estimate of $5,000 a year or more or less is just not going to happen. The only way that I see that this makes financial sense to the town is if you remove the 124 boat from service. Then it makes some possible sense, not on a federal basis, but on a town basis, because this boat basically can do the same thing the 124 does, and you keep the same boats. That makes financial sense. You keep the same manning requirements. I'm a little concerned that we have not thought about what the fire department says about putting out fires with a fireboat. My understanding is that there have only been 2 issues with fires in all the years that they've kept records. One was a brush fire, one was a boat fire, and unless the fireboat was tied up to the boat with the fire at the time of the fire, it wasn't going to do anybody any good. And so I don't see this as a firefighting benefit to the town of any sort. The houses are too far away and the capacity is too low. It only comes down to whether or not you can replace a boat, and I think if you replace it, it may make financial sense. I see bracket creep with this. If you add this boat, the police department sooner or later is going to ask for more people. You cannot operate 4 boats at the same cost as 3. So I just suggest that you should consider it's not the cost that they say now. Sooner or later, Marine Police will go from 7 to 8, because if you want 4 boats and you want to have them out at the same time, you need more people than you have. You will have a larger staff one way or the other. You will have higher costs. And I just think the town has more pressing issues. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Caldwell?
Thank you. Mr. Isbranson covered a great deal of what I wanted to say, and I'm not going to repeat it because I think he said it better than I could. I do want to clarify one thing. The newspaper seemed concerned that my opposition to this boat was a head-scratcher. I'm not really opposed to it. I kind of feel that the way Hans does, and that is that we have more boats than we really need for the kind of service that we want from them, and that if we were to take out one of the older boats and replace it with this one, that makes good economic sense to me, and it meets the need of the town. Now, I have 2 other issues, and one of them is very serious because you, Mr. Walco, come to us every May and look at the RTM and say, look, we only deal with 20% of the budget. You deal with 80% of the budget when you pass those contracts. I believe that the way this thing has been outlined to us, we are setting the town up for a very serious turf issue between the fire and the police department. Only the fire department has the right to negotiate fire suppression issues. And we have said that this boat is going to be available to address that particular problem if it develops along the shore or on the water. In discussing it with members of the Labor Contracts Committee and Mr. Carver, we all see the same thing. This is an aggressive union, and you can believe that it's not going to be too far down the road that they're going to come in and say, wait a minute, we deal with fire. We believe that there should be fire representation or a fire presence on that boat, because when a 911 call comes in, you cannot in advance anticipate what kind of a call it's going to be. So that means making someone available on the boat, because there's a loss of time if they have to come from Central, and a bigger loss of time if the boat has to put in to pick them up somewhere along the line. That means stipends. We're paying the police department a stipends right now for water service. Can't quite figure out why, because I always thought that was the cushy service. I think that we'd be very foolish not to understand the risk in this. It's an issue which, if it comes up, we're not going to win it. Don't kid yourself. The arbitrators and the State Labor Board will find for the other side. So please be careful. Then with regard to staffing, I tend to agree with Hans. If you got 3 boats or 4 boats that work, there's going to be pressure to keep them moving during the year, and particularly on weekends. That means 7 people aren't going to be enough. You're just kidding yourselves. And since this thing comes to the RTM, we can only vote it up and down. We can't put any conditions on it. So if you don't think it through and you don't put the conditions on it before we agree to accept it or before the matter comes to the RTM, we just take it and throw caution to the wind and hope that some of these issues that I'm concerned about do not materialize. Finally, Pete Minarski has been trying to get a list of boats that we insure. He gave me a list a year ago. I asked him for an update about a month and a half ago. He gave me the update. Interesting. The update was the same as the one from a year ago, and I knew that one had problems. I have spent probably 2 weeks trying to locate boats. I don't know where they all are, and I don't think he should know. I think that we have gotten to the point with boats or things that float, because some of them are really rafts, where we were with the fleet department. And we better make sure that we know where they're located, who's responsible for them. Do we carry hull, insurance, and liability, or just liability? But this loosey-goosey business of having a maybe list is dangerous, and it's bad management. It also gives us an opportunity to consolidate and to manage the maintenance, because to replace diesels in 10 years, I'm told that's kind of unusual. Thank you very much.
Mr. Pecora?
Sil Pecora. I've been on the water all my life. I think the boat is a good thing for us to get because of the kind of boat it is. But I have to agree with both of the first two speakers. Lieutenant Brown has stated that it will extend the life of the other two boats, the 124 and the 125. Well, by extending it, they won't operate all of three of them at once. They'll be operating because they don't have the manpower. Well, that alone tells you something. All I'm saying is replace rather than add would be far greater thing for the town, a lot cheaper. And I don't say go down to 3 boats, stay at 3. It should be 2. The boat, when we picked up the boat 2 years ago, they were supposed to get rid of the glass boat, and they still have it. Whether they get rid of the 124 or the 125, it doesn't bother me. It's up to the police department, I would think. I don't think we should refuse this boat, but I don't think we should buy it in addition to what we have. And again, if you don't put, like Joan said, if you don't put the restrictions on it, we're going to end up with 4 boats. 11 years ago, we had 1. Thank you.
Oh, Peter? Our first selectman, Peter Tessie.
Good evening, Mr. Chairman, members of the BET. I just want to touch base on some elements of what was stated this evening. The first being the number of boats within the department. I think we heard very clearly last Tuesday evening that presently the police department has 3 boats. If you were thinking about them, 2 of them certainly fall within the same category or same capability. The third does not, and that is a fiberglass boat that the department has had for many years, and it was to be decommissioned, but when they went to look for or find a bidder on it, it had little value, so they retained it. I think the chief of police was very clear that if it makes people more comfortable, they will dispose of the boat, but the boat does have a purpose, and the purpose is providing protection to those who participate and recreate on Long Island Sound in organizations' special events. And the way it works is that organizations like the Indian Harbor or Swim Across America, whomever is hosting a recreation event on the Sound, contracts for police marine service. They pay for the police to take them out or have someone out on the water while these events are occurring. There's sometimes dozens, if not hundreds, of participants. Several years ago, a police chief made the decision that they were required to have this protection. Why? Because a participant became engorged on one of the propellers of the boat and lost a sensitive body part. At that time, it was said they should have someone present during these races. So what they did is they kept that fiberglass boat for that purpose. The cost borne by the organizers of the event, and the town receives compensation for the fuel that is used. So I think we want to distinguish those boats that are employed by the Marine Division for the protection of life and property of the general population, and the boat that is used exclusively for the purposes of protecting individuals at special events. In terms of the inventory of boats, I think oftentimes people throw things up against the wall to see if they will stick. I don't know. We're not distinguishing public safety boats, parks and rec boats. Specifically to public safety boats, Chief Szynski provided, and I gave to you, the list of what we would refer to as inflatables that are employed in ponds, in tributaries within the mainland of the town, very different than the boats we're talking about to be employed on Long Island Sound, that not only has high-value property, high inventory of exclusive and expensive boats, but has a number of infrastructure that are critical. Last evening, the Manus River Bridge, you may be aware there was an explosion on the deck. It shut down the entire highway. You could see flames from all over. The point being, did we stop and think that who responded? The Greenwich Fire Department responded, along with the rest of the EMS. Costs borne by the town of Greenwich. There's no reimbursement from the state. The same holds true on the water now. There is an increasingly growing shift of passing down the cost to carry out services to municipalities. We've seen it with the Coast Guard. It was delineated a little bit in the presentation. If something occurs, we are going to be the first responder. And therefore, we're being allocated this boat to be able to do that in the best possible manner. And that is part of the grant acceptance, that we are required to respond, as we are now, with the apparatus to, again, protect life first and property second. As far as labor issues, I think that's we could operate in fear out of what we think is going to happen. I certainly think the climate with regard to labor unions has changed dramatically in this state. I will say stay tuned. By September, we will have a decision on one of the interest arbitrations as it relates to the fire department in terms of centralized dispatch. If that's any comfort to Ms. Caldwell, if we prevail on that, then I think maybe she could find the way to not have this be the impediment to moving the town forward and enhancing our waterfront marine capabilities. But I certainly would not let that be an influencing factor because, again, I think it's operating out of fear. Our job is to be prepared, and that's what I believe this allows us to do, is to be more prepared by having an additional resource that has further capabilities to protect people. Thank you.
Further discussion by the board. All right, so my understanding is that the Budget Committee passed this originally 4-0 to move it along to this body. Sure.
I think the discussions moving forward is that because this boat won't be here, and it probably will not, it won't affect this summer patrol season. The chief's here and Lieutenant Allen's here. It won't affect this summer patrol season. Most likely it will impact maybe the latter half of next patrol season, which actually takes us into another budget. I think the plan is that during the budget deliberations, I think if this goes through, I think the police department's going to have that conversation amongst themselves, what equipment they want to maintain, what they do not want to maintain. Yes, the question is there. Could we, as a finance board, could we say to them, okay, something has to go? Yes, we could. However, with the grant that's on the new boat, I think this just allows us time during the next budget cycle to be able to make those decisions there as we go through on what we want to operate, how many pieces of equipment we want to operate. I mean, here we're a town that when the LTDs were going out, we go out and buy 9 extra police cars ahead of time because we know that we don't know what the replacement's going to be. So I think this is a step-by-step process. I the same concerns came out in our committee meeting about the lack of Coast Guard service. The same concerns came out about where are we going with staffing. The same concerns came out about, are we staffing this with GEMS? Are we staffing this with career firefighters? Are the volunteer firefighters accessible to the boat? All of this was answered in our deliberations, and I think that we as a BET, it's a step-by-step process. And I think that, and I can't speak for the department, but I think they understand where the concerns lie, and that we have some future thoughts that need to go into this.
Mr. Finger?
I'd just like to add, maybe for the public's benefit who are watching tonight and were not able to attend the Budget Committee meeting last Tuesday, many of the issues that were raised this evening by Mr. Isbranson, Mr. Pecora, and Ms. Caldwell were addressed in the presentation by the Police Department, the Fire Department, and the First Selectman. Police and Fire addressed staffing issues, the labor issues were discussed, the number of boats were discussed, how they be staffed, as I mentioned, and the Fire Chief also gave we were all very impressed with the presentation that he gave on where he thought the benefits were as the Chief of the Greenwich Fire Department. And we had these questions. They were answered, I think, very thoroughly and probably representative of the vote 4-0. The Budget Committee other members of the Budget Committee were likewise impressed.
All those in favor of PD2 signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Abstention. 11-0-0. Let me say in closing on this particular item, though, that I think, and I did hear from many members about this notion of having 4 boats as opposed to 3 boats and having an additional boat. And Mr. Mason alluded to it in terms of next year's budget, but I would jump even further ahead. I wasn't supportive of a subject to release to get rid of another boat, but I would have an expectation that the police department looks seriously at reducing their fleet by 1 boat, because in fact this still has to go through the RTM approval. And of all the people who are supportive of this, many are still supportive of this boat not adding to the existing fleet. And so, and I'm not prepared to tell the police department which boat they should take out of commission or which boat they should decommission. But certainly I think that's something that should be addressed, as I've heard that from a number of people, and that should be given consideration over the next few months before it gets to the RTM. But there is no subject, just to be clear, there's no subject to release on it. So as it stands right now, this will just move forward to the RTM without any condition. Okay. PW1 now comes before us. Mr. Mason.
PW1, Department of Public Works, a release of condition of $100,000 park pool study, and I move that on behalf of the Budget Committee.
Moved by Mr. Mason, second by Mr. Simon. Discussion.
PW1 is probably one of our better applications of the evening. It's a release of conditions. The conditions goes back to that the Junior League of Greenwich would be donating a portion of the monies that would go towards the design and investigation from Parks and Rec Department into replacing the bar and pool. The check has arrived. The check has been deposited. Came from the Parks and Rec Foundation of the 501c3, and the feasibility study should continue if we approve this. And we're hoping that, again, as we stated originally, that this project obviously is one of our placeholder projects, but we're hoping that this is a public-private partnership, obviously, as we move forward. And our vote was 4-0 in favor of it.
Discussion. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Abstention. 11-0-0. PW2 now comes before us.
If I may, PW2 is Public Works, $150,000 release of condition, Town Hall space utilization. And I so move that item.
Moved by Mr. Mason, second by Mr. Simon. Discussion.
PW2 is a release of a condition for the Town Hall space utilization. We on the BET have been asking to keep our infrastructure up to speed, but we've also asked to improve space utilization, offer our internal customers and external customers a better experience. To date, we have taken the monies that we've appropriated on this through the several budgets, and we have been doing a systematic renovation. As we've gone through the building and gutted the building, we're putting in all new piping, all new ductwork, all new carpeting, all new finishing, all new cat wire, communications. However, the real core of this is how do we expand our areas and create a better customer service area for the residents coming in. When asked, we had the Commissioner Siebert there and Al Manelli from Department of Public Works. The challenge that we seem to be running into is that we just do not have swing space. It's very hard. We do not have area where we can pull a department out of a specific location and renovate. The current release, what the department would like to do is to do some work in the basement floor to create office there, redevelop the health lab for the people that are going through that. And also it would work on the area on the first floor here with the probate. Again, going forward, as we want to improve the customer service space, we're really looking for some swing space, which we don't have it. But in this particular case, these two projects, one of them certainly is a slight step towards that. So our vote was 4-0 in favor.
Discussion? Just so it's also clear, the last item, the last two items, quite frankly, and this item, these are all release of conditions or approval to use grants. So if someone's doing a tally at home as to how much taxpayer money we're spending, these are all items that have been previously budgeted, and we're simply releasing conditions that the BET placed on these items during the last budget cycle. Okay, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Abstention? 11-0-0. PW3 now comes before us.
PW3, Public Works, release of conditions, $175,000, which if I was to offer an amendment, I think should be really $100,000. And that's for release of conditions for King Street Fire Station, architectural and engineering. And I so move that.
Moved by Mr. Mason. Second by Mr. Simon. Maybe we can take a step back before I turn it over to the Budget Committee Chair to go through this. So, Roland or Peter, if you can help me with the numbers a little bit, because I'm not sure that they're accurate on our blue sheets. So on our blue sheets, it lists subject to release of $175,000. But I thought we only conditioned 100 of that. Okay. And in that account, only about 14 or so has been used, or less than that? 11,000 has been used, the first selectment. So is that about your number as well? So really, the DPW currently has 64,000 to use, and the subject to release is only on the 100, right? Okay. You want to give a report now, and then we'll come back? Give a report. So. Just give a report on what was before us then.
The King Street Fire Station is a discussion that started back in the year 2004 when the town chose to buy a piece of property adjacent to the Griffith E. Harris Golf Course to add another firefighting career station and a location for GEMS. To date, we've bought the property, we've paid for the property. 2 budgets ago, not last budget, but the prior year before that, there was an appropriation requested for A&E for the King Street Fire Station. As you hear, the Board of Estimate Taxation put a condition, a subject to release, on $100,000 of that money. The $75,000 remaining, we had asked that DPW investigate the feasibility and basically come to the conclusion of what we would be able to develop on that site for those purposes in nature due to the septic. Obviously, it's up in a high part of the town, and there were some land issues. To date, DPW has spent about $11,000 and has come back to us with preliminary that a septic system would fit on the property. Basically, if I was to describe it, in the corner between the driveway to the golf course and the King Street Road itself. This would cause the main building to be set back approximately 200 feet. It would allow for what we're being told 4 persons to be in the dwelling. That's what the septic would be able to handle, and 2 garage bays. With that being said, questions in our committee were coming up okay, so it doesn't sound like we're going to be making our original mission statement of putting gems and the firefighting in there. Questions came up about the impact of the golf course, relocating the driveway, the cost, increasing the drainage. You can't put a septic system in that you have a big, large parking lot that flows water into, and that would defeat the purpose. So the questions were there. We had a very lengthy discussion on this. The issue before us actually came to a point where there was actually a question about the total feasibility on this project. The first selectman has requested from us to commit this money to go with the architectural and engineering to decide what we can, via zoning, equipment, loadings on the property, et cetera, what we can put on the property. With that being said, going back to our original purchase of the property, and I believe if you look in your budget, you will see that we have about $2.2 million earmarked for the construction of this station. Without adding to my committee report, today receiving an email from Department of Public Works on just the cost of realigning the front of the property, I think the general consensus came out that in the committee, and I would encourage the other members, somewhere we have to come to a point of making the decision on this property. Is this the piece of property for what we want to do? The consensus of the committee was the first selectman thinks that he needs a portion of this money to take the A&E to a point where we could get those answers to that. With that being said, the committee, obviously knowing that this had to go to the full board, voted 4 in favor and 0 against to release this condition. Obviously, what the town's choices are, we have to get to a point where we're going to make a decision on this as we go forward.
Let me think. So I'll open it up for discussion in a second here, but after reading the explanos, and I think based on the information that was not only provided previously but also in our packets and then in our budget committee, I'm not wholly convinced that appropriating or releasing the money today, I'm not sure what we're going to get for the $100,000 versus the $60,000 and what information we would ultimately get or then need to make a determination relative to this site. And I see it more as a communication issue than a substantive issue. And so if there's support, I would certainly entertain a motion to postpone this until the September meeting. DPW has $60,000 to work with now. They have that money to continue to work on this, and our condition is only on $100,000. And at that point, I'd like to better understand not only what the deliverable would be for the $100,000, but then also internally how this board would use that information to make a decision, assuming that we release the money. Because as I talk to board members, I'm not sure it's clear exactly what information everyone is expecting from the release of this condition to then go ahead and support the project. Because I think there generally is support for a backcountry station. I think it's just how we get there to make sure we're thoughtful in our approach. And I don't think there's really any time delay in this by moving this to the September meeting, knowing that they already have $60,000 to work with between now and then.
Mr. Chairman?
Mr. Norton.
Not being a member of the Budget Committee, I will make that motion to postpone this till the September meeting.
Okay. I'll entertain it just to get it on the table. I was more hoping to get some thoughts from people on that. But there's motion by Mr. Norton, second by Mr. Raymer to postpone this to our September meeting. Further discussion on that point. Mr. Raymer and then Mr. Finger.
There's a piece of this that, although I strongly favor the idea of developing appropriate fire suppression capability in northwest Greenwich, it's an area of town where we seem to be having some population growth. There's lots of value of property and lots of human life, and our coverage in the northwest corner seems to be marginal, I guess is the best word that I want to pick. And I think this town has the capability to improve on that. What I don't want is to spend $100,000 or $175,000 to do further inspection of something and then reach a conclusion later on that the site seems somehow inadequate for our purposes, when in large measure, I think most of us can sort of predict today exactly what we're going to be told in the end, and that is that this is a site that can give us some coverage in Northwest Greenwich, but the site has some limitations. It has limitations on the number of personnel that it can house. It has limitations on the number of pieces of equipment that it can accommodate. It's not able to accommodate GEMS as well as fire. It's only going to be able to support one uniform service. And if those are going to be reasons not to do the development at that site, I'd rather make that decision soon rather than spend $175,000 or whatever it's going to be to reach the decision that we should have reached back in July. I favor the idea of putting this over to September. It's why I seconded Mr. Norton's motion. I'm a little disappointed not to have Chief Szynski here because there were one or two questions that I and perhaps others wanted to frame to explore with him in a little greater detail what his expectations are about the sufficiency of the site. I wanted to probe carefully because his view is worth so much more than mine anyway, maybe for the rest of my colleagues too. How marginal is this marginal site? How adequate would it be? Does he feel that this site, if developed, would fill an important need, or would he feel that it is really substandard and inadequate, in which event maybe we should be looking at the possibility of other sites or trying to approach this differently? So for all those reasons, sorry to talk so long, for all those reasons, I'm seconding Mr. Norton's motion. I'd like to put this over to September, and I'd be very grateful if in the scheduling of the valuable time of Chief Szynski, if arrangements could be made for us to have some dialogue with him either at that meeting or at some other meeting at a prior time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Finger?
Mr. Raymer addressed every issue that I was going to raise. Thank you, Mr. Raymer.
Ms. Tarkington?
Yes, I think that the fact that there is over $60,000 to continue work on this project, I think gives some time for some of the questions to be answered. One of the things that I would like to see is if there's any possibility to adapt the septic system such that an additional bedroom can be there to include GEMS in the facility. I think the other thing that we found in the Budget Committee meeting is an unanticipated cost of up to $1.3 million for the parking lot adjacent to the firehouse location, which basically would increase obviously up to $1.3 million is a substantial amount of money when we're considering, our budget very closely. But I think that having the additional time to make sure that we can't co-locate both GEMS with the fire facility would be very constructive, and work can continue because there is funds to do some additional work.
Good evening. Just want to address a couple points. The first being that the condition that you placed on the appropriation was to determine whether or not, due to the limitations on septic, GEMS could be situated here. And I think for the $11,000 or just shy of $11,000, Mr. Minnelli has given that as an answer. So just in terms of perfunctory reporting, that was the condition on $100,000 to get it released. And from a fact point of view, that was met based upon what he provided. That being said, clearly there were very good questions raised at the Budget Committee in terms of are there alternate systems that could improve upon the septic fields and divert into the one at the golf course. I mean, I've heard various permutations to it. I know Chief Szynski, when speaking to him on Friday, just feels very determined that there has to be a way that we could accommodate GEMS. And I've talked to Chief Tufts, and of course she would desire to see the same outcome. So in the interim period, if we can look at that, we will, and I think that's a constructive exercise, but I don't think we necessarily will be surprised if we are told again that their limitations are what they are. In terms of the parking lot that Ms. Tarkington raised, that issue came up because clearly we were looking at other ways to improve upon the utility of the site, and I think that was as a part of realigning the driveway to give better access and egress, taking the Griff's driveway and moving it over. And also, Mr. Finger had a very good suggestion in terms of trying to resituate the building. I think you raised that. And again, that certainly could be incorporated into the analysis. But I want to point out, Ms. Tarkington, you said $1.3 million. You are correct, but it is important to note that that figure consists of two parts. The first part being what it would cost without the firehouse being in the equation at all to redo the Griff parking lot, and that's $675,000. And then the fire station reconfiguration would be the $617,500. So not to misrepresent to the listeners out there that it's $1.3 million. Just as it relates to the fire station, it's there are two parts to it. I just think it's important to clarify. And then finally, it's important to clarify that initially we acquired the property in 2004, and we all, and myself included, being a member of the BET, were told that this would be a location for both fire and GEMS. And I think it's, again, disappointing when the concept does not meet the reality. And that was what the then first selectman envisioned for us and what we predicated all of our decisions since then. That was his, I want to say, back of the hand assessment. Clearly, without having the benefit of land use restrictions, we're learning something different. But I do believe that the priority for the residents of Northwest Greenwich, and Alan Williams, who's vice president of that association, is here, is certainly for fire protection first. And if GEMS can be accommodated, that as well. So moving forward, if we can, in the course of the next 30-plus days, refine what deliverable you're looking for, I'm certainly happy to work with you to achieve that.
Mr. Simon.
I think it's important. I mean, one of the things that I'm concerned about, although, I voted to buy the land, is that are we going to be able to build a fire station, and only a fire station, that's adequate to meet our needs to provide fire protection in the Northwest Greenwich? We have a very unusual shaped property. We bought this a long time ago thinking this was going to be able to solve our problems, and I don't know how much money you need to answer that question. Because if it turns out our concerns, at least when we talked about it, was that we're going to end up with an inferior product. We don't have the land that will support what we really want for a fire station. And if that's true, maybe we shouldn't have bought the land, but we can sell the land. But I think it would be nice to be able to answer that question, and that we can then proceed at a reasonable cost to build a fire station that meets the needs of providing fire protection in Northwest Greenwich.
Let me just make a suggestion. Well, why don't we make this suggestion? We've talked about this, and I know the fire chief and the first selectman have spent countless hours in meeting with various BET members, various committees of the BET. I know DPW has been involved in those discussions, and there have been numerous ones over the years. But why don't we try to set something up? I'll appoint two members of this body to set up a meeting with Chief Szynski, the first selectman's office, DPW. We'll make sure everybody's aware of when that meeting is, so that they can filter questions in beforehand concerning this, and that we have the month of August to go into that, get the questions in advance. The two individuals can then report back to the BET about their findings well in advance of our September meeting, so that there are follow-up questions we can have them answered, so that we can use the money and use the money wisely towards a solution that I think, well, hopefully that there's consensus around. Because I don't think it's a matter of using the money, and I don't think it's a matter of whether or not there's support for the project. It's a matter of we want to make sure that the money is being spent to answer the questions that we have, and if decisions have already been made or the facts are crystal clear, then maybe we make decisions sooner rather than later to ensure that we keep the process moving. Does that a fair statement? Okay, so if that's amenable, I'll meet with the two caucuses, find out who the two representatives are, and we'll make sure that that information gets distributed. Okay? So on the motion then to postpone, it's the Norton motion, second by Raymer, to the September meeting. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstention. 12-0-0. Mr. Kelly, welcome. We started talking about the fire department and you were here. It was magical. All right, item 3 now comes before us. Routine applications. For that, I call on our clerk, Joe Pellegrino.
Mr. Chairman, this evening I'd like to move 3 routine applications. The first comes from the Commission on Aging, that's CA1, and this is a request to transfer $10,000 from the regular salaries account to the household account to replace existing furniture in the senior center.
CA1 has been moved
Yes.
by Mr. Pellegrino.
Second.
Second by Mr. Mason.
Okay. The second application comes from the Finance Department. It is FI1, and this is a request to transfer $1,550,000 from the health care account to workers' compensation and unemployment accounts. This is for the purpose of covering the increased cost of workers' compensation, health care costs, and unemployment. That allocation is broken down $1,478,000 for workers' compensation and $72,000 for unemployment.
Moved by Mr. Pellegrino. Second by Mr. Simon.
And the third routine application that comes before us is from the Police Department. This is PD1, and it is a request for an additional appropriation of $43,218. This request is for permission to use that money to acquire and install telecommunication equipment to move the Emergency Operations Center to police headquarters. And the funding for it will come from a grant in the Telecommunications Fund.
Moved by Mr. Pellegrino. Second by Mr. Simon. So these are routine applications. I know the Budget Committee had initially listed these as non-routine. We have a lengthy agenda this evening, and it's probably already gone over than my estimated time. Obviously, the amounts of the transfers of within finance is routine, except it is $1.55 million, although I think the Finance Department, again, did an excellent job in explaining where the money was needed and where it came from, and as well as the fact that the additional appropriation is needed for the Police Department and the Emergency Operations Center.
If I may just add a comment,
Sure.
Mr. Chairman, the first two, the Commission on Aging for $10,000 and the Finance for $1,550,000 are for fiscal year 10-11. It's only the police request is for fiscal year 11-12.
Okay, thank you. Discussion? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Abstention. 12-0-0. Item 4 now comes before us. Our Town Assessor, Ted Gwartney, and Assistant Town Assessor, Bob Shipman. Can we do the HDG report before we get to yours? Would you mind?
Good
I do
evening.
apologize for last month's meeting.
Good evening, Mr. Chairman and members of the board. We've had a busy period explaining assessments to people, keeping our office busy. We're now focusing on the 2011 grand list, which will be being produced October of this year. In my report, I've talked about the number of appeals to the Superior Court. The total number is 103 appeals. 35 are residential and 68 are non-residential. From the prior revaluation, there was one case that was settled during the last period. It was a retail office building located at 280 Railroad Avenue. And I'm very glad to say that we had a record number of sales that were processed during the month of June, 138 valid residential sales, which is a record number over the last 5 years. The assessor's website has been edited to make it right up to date, and we've added the additional residential sales onto the website so that the public has access to all of the information up to date. Be glad to answer any questions that you may have.
Questions for the assessor? Ted, just so it's crystal clear, not only to this board, but to the public. So June, there was 138 sales, which you said was a record over the past 5 years.
Yes,
For any given month or just the month of June?
for all months. And that does not include the non-residential. There was also a number of non-residential sales.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Campbell?
It might just be worth noting that the state of Connecticut increased the conveyance tax by 25% effective July 1st, and there are a lot of people who don't want to pay that higher tax, so I think that might account for some of those transactions.
Yes.
Further discussion? Is there a motion to accept the assessor's report?
So moved.
Moved by Ms. Tarkington. Second by Mr. Raymer. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, abstention. Thank you. Comptroller's report now comes before us. Our Comptroller, Peter Wynarski.
Good evening, Mr. Chairman, BET members. One of the highlights of the Comptroller's report, which is also the highlight of the Treasurer's report and the cash forecast, is the unusually high cash balance at June 30th of $72 million. We had one of the reports that was in the Comptroller's report every month was the tax collector's review that we stopped last month, and because it was somewhat uneventful, and we happened to have one of the most unusual Junes of all time for the town of Greenwich. There was over $30 million in prepayments. People started prepaying around June 21st. The tax bills went out very early this year as opposed to last year. So the $72 million cash balance, which will show up on the CAFR, which will look very good when we go for a credit review, actually has about $30 million of prepayments, which are tax collections. However, we did go from approximately, in the cash forecast, a little over $12 million 2 years ago to $28 million to approximately $42 million general fund cash, which is excellent for us when we go to the credit rating people, because 2 years ago, when we were carrying the large negative fund balance due to the modified pay-as-you-go, we also had a low point with the cash at $12 million. So it's really turned around as far as the cash flows. Having said that, I apologize for getting the report to you late. I'll entertain any questions now that you may have in the Comptroller's report.
Discussion, Mr. Norton.
Mr. Chairman, could I indicate that the Investment Advisory Committee met this morning, and we reviewed this, and I want to bring to everybody's attention the line on which we focus, or which I personally focus, which is the net cash, which every month, and actually it shows the net cash at the end of June of actually $44 million, which then when you add to it the amount of additional monies received from the fiscal 12 prepayment of taxes is what brings us to the $72 million.
Thank you. Further discussion? Is there a motion to approve the Comptroller's report?
So moved.
Moved by Mr. Norton, second by Mr. Simon. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, abstention, 12-0-0. Item 6 now comes before us, the Treasurer's report. Is there a motion to accept?
So moved.
Moved by Mr. Norton, second by Mr. Pellegrino. Discussion? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, abstention, 12-0-0. Items 7, 8, and 9 now come before us. Those are our standing committee reports, liaison reports, and special project team reports. You should have had in your packet the Nathaniel Witherell Town Building Committee report, the revaluation team report, the BET, that's the recommendation will be taken up later. Those are the two written reports. Are there any questions concerning the written reports or otherwise? Okay.
Mr. Chairman?
Ms. Tarkington?
I had one question on the Witherall Building Committee report. It spending of funds up to $67,000. I was wondering how that number was chosen. I believe we had approved a larger number or the release of a larger number at a recent meeting.
Mr. Pellegrino.
Ms. Tarkington, we had approved up to $100,000 for the release, but Mr. Toretta reported at our meeting that in discussions with SLAM that they were only requesting up to $67,000 for the work that was going to be required.
Mm-hmm.
So we felt as a committee that it would be foolish to authorize anything above what was being asked. That's how the $67,000 number came about.
Thank you.
Relative to the revaluation team report, and just more for scheduling purposes, and I know in your report you indicate that you're gaining or gathering information relative to making a recommendation for the next reval. When do you think would be an appropriate time to slot in that discussion? September looks like a busy month already. Would October be enough time?
I believe previously you had scheduled it for November, but if you want to move it back to October, we're flexible. So
Okay.
we can do either November or October.
Let me take a look at that analysis, and then we'll get together. Item 10 now comes before us, Chairman's report. Over the past month, certainly the BET is working, and through its chairman, working to make sure that the Hay study is moving along, as well as the Project Renew study, of which we're going to receive a report tonight. That's been taking up a vast amount of time, as well as ensuring that the debt and fund balance policy discussion kept on track, and the policies and procedures. And for the committees who have been dealing with all of those issues, I commend them. I know the Hay Group was in last week doing a series of interviews, and this all falls on top of the Finance Department losing one of its prized employees, in Anthony Giovanone. We wish him all the best in moving over to the Board of Ed. Relative to that, you should also be aware that the quarterly reports on the Hamilton Avenue litigation was also provided between this meeting and our prior meeting. And so if ever there is a need to discuss that, you can either talk to the Law Committee or, in fact, contact me for that update. So item 11 now comes before us. We have under old business, we'll first take up the debt and fund balance policy discussion. They are now two policies. We have a proposed Town of Greenwich debt policy, and we have a Town of Greenwich fund balance policy. So why don't we first take up the fund balance policy? This has been discussed, debated for the past 3 months or so between our Budget Committee and our Audit Committee. And I think it last landed in the lap of the Budget Committee, and so why don't we start there to get this before us so that we can have our discussion then. So, Mr. Mason, Chair of our Budget Committee.
So, in front of you, the first document is the Town of Greenwich fund balance. Quick background for the residents in town. That we first got notice about 6 to 8 months ago that the Town of Greenwich did not have a formal debt policy or was not in keeping with the accounting standards for an unreserved fund balance on behalf of the town. That led into a directive from our chairman, the Audit Committee and its members, thank you, and the Budget Committee members began with a draft. The process has been very lengthy. To date, I think we're, as far as with the fund balance policy, we seem to be living our policy that we haven't adopted yet, because you heard in the controller's report that our fund balance is back on the rise. The document you have before you has been through the Budget Committee as recently as right before our meeting here tonight, and you'll see the draft on the bottom is Budget Committee July 18th, which is today. It has some corrections on it. Our vote on the fund balance was 4-0. Basically, the fund balance policy looks for the town to maintain somewhere between 5 and 10% of, and I'll read it so it's actually clear, 5 to 10% of the undesignated fund balance of the general fund, unassigned, meaning no commitments to that. With that being said, again, this document has been through at least 2 committees. Each committee has voted on it at least 2 times. It's something that the credit agencies are looking for, I believe. So we've had outside counsel help us with this document. So on the fund balance, I can speak for the Budget Committee, and if Mr. Norton wants, I can speak for the Audit Committee. Both committees have had a positive 4-0 vote on those 2 documents. On that particular document.
Hold on, let's take up that. So,
Mr. Chairman.
It's been moved by Mr. Mason, the fund balance policy.
I will second it then.
Second by Mr. Norton. Discussion.
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Norton.
last Thursday, the Audit Committee met and considered this policy. At that time, there were a few editorial changes that hadn't been made, which were made this afternoon by the Budget Committee. But other than those editorial changes that were made, the Audit Committee voted 4-0 to recommend this policy.
Thank you. Further discussion. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Abstention. I think we just set a record for vote of a policy by the BET, especially with this many attorneys up here. So I say that because I know how much time went into the wordsmithing of this and the substance behind it. And so I do applaud both Mr. Mason, Mr. Norton, and the help of Mr. Pellegrino in shepherding this through. So now that we have one down, let's see if we can keep on a roll and address the next one. And for that, I'll call on Mr. Mason again for the debt policy.
The debt policy of the town's a little bit different. Well, the 2 committees have reviewed it. However, the review from the committee leaves out the numbers. And the numbers that we're basically talking about are the numbers of what we would consider maximum outstanding debt on behalf of the town, and what we would consider the percentage of the capital tax levy that we would like to apply in any one given year towards commitment of debt that we have on behalf of the town. The document has gone through several drafts. One of the key items in this document, I think, before we get to the numbers, is that the definition of debt as it relates to the town, our controller was very helpful on this, comes actually right out of our CAFR. It's as it's defined in our annual report for the town. It's any obligation of the town. With that being said, whether we were to take on debt for Nathaniel Witherell, even though there might be revenues that offset that, or we have the debt of the sewers where in the maintenance fund where half of that is paid, it's still an obligation to the town, so we still wanted to recognize that and pick that up as we work towards this. This document had slow progress, so the Audit Committee, in their wisdom, decided to work on the draft without the numbers, without the debate on the numbers. The Budget Committee had not done that, and we had come to some early numbers that we were very close with. All of the numbers, when we get to talking about this, and I'll expand when we get to that, are predicated on the models that this BET has worked on over the past 2 budgets to work on replenishing fund balance, getting a handle on what we could afford, what we were willing to commit to as a town in debt servicing, what projects we could get to, where our operating budget was going, with all that said. So the document before you has been through with some slight corrections, which are highlighted, through the Audit Committee, 4-0, with the numbers blank, if I'm correct, Mr. Norton, and through the Budget Committee, 4-0, again, leaving out the numbers. It would be my opinion that if we're in agreement with this document, I think we're and I must say this, part of the work that went into this, I think most of us are fairly comfortable with the numbers as we speak, and I don't know if you want to pass the document first and then modify it to put the numbers in.
Why don't you move the document?
So, okay. So with that said, the document as you see it here is complete. It just needs the limitation numbers to be inserted.
I'll second that as well, and then if I can make a comment, Mr. Chairman.
Moved by Mr. Mason, second by Mr. Norton. Discussion.
Mr. Chairman, the audit committee met last Thursday, the 14th of July, and considered this document, and other than some editorial changes that were made this afternoon, we voted 4-0 to support it and recommend it.
So, as they would say, the devil's in the details. On page 2, the top 2 bullet points have either double X's, double Y's, or double Z's for numbers that are missing. And so now that this document is before us, I would entertain a motion to insert numbers in that so that we can have that discussion and ultimately take a completed document to a vote. Mr. Simon.
Okay. I move that for the first bullet, we put in 70% for the double X's.
So let's just take these one at a time so that we don't mix the discussion. So it's been moved by Mr. Simon.
Second.
Second by Ms. Tarkington to have the document read, maintain the ratio of annual general fund debt service, including principal and interest expenditures, to no more than 70% of the annual capital tax levy. Discussion on that amendment.
We can bring that one to a vote separately from the other, Mr. Chairman.
Yes. Discussion on that amendment. Mr. Simon? Discussion on your motion.
Do I have to discuss it?
Well, it's your motion.
All right. I think when we look at our model and we see what we can afford, I think the 70% is a number that fits in with leaving enough money in cash to pay for different projects while at the same time giving us the sufficient balances to pay off our debt. It's a number that I think has come out of looking at the model and gives us a measure of safety. Clearly going above 70% leaves us insufficient cash in order to do projects, and below 70 does not support our current capital plan. So this is the number I recommend.
Further discussion. Mr. Raymer.
It's important to note that among the 12 of us that sit on this board are 12 people that come to this with different points of view, with a feeling that they serve at times different constituencies. And I think it's important to note that this figure and the figure that we'll be talking about in just a minute, the debt ceiling figure, are figures where 12 people have made an effort to come together in a collaborative way. The figures, plural, that we're arriving at are not necessarily the first choices of everyone. In my particular case, neither one of these figures were my first choices. But I think there's something positive to be said at a time when perhaps not every board enjoys that reputation, that this is a process of 12 strong-willed people coming together on a collaborative figure, and I think we've reached that kinds of consensus. And if we're allowed to offer certain words of self-congratulations, assuming we can agree on this number and the next number, I think there has been an important process that has taken place here, and that should be noted for the public.
Thank you, Mr. Hold on. Mr. Huffman, then Mr. Pellegrino, and then Mr. Mason.
Well, I concur that a lot of work has been done, and I think people should be pleased that we have come a long way with this process. But I continue to have concerns about some aspects of this as a policy turning into potentially a straitjacket, and I particularly am not wildly enthusiastic about this number, much less the numbers to follow.
Mr. Pellegrino.
Mr. Chairman, I just wanted to add, in addition to Mr. Simon's comments, which I agree with, what I want to say here, I think to the public that's important, is what this ratio is saying is for each dollar we are being taxed, at least 30%, if not more, is actually going to go towards capital improvements, not debt service. That's essentially what this ratio that we've been discussing is about. And I think there's some comfort to know that that's a number that we drew and agreed upon, so that people know that when they're being taxed, not more money is going to debt service, it's actually going into the projects.
Mr. Mason.
Thank you, Mr. Pellegrino. I think, as an example, so people understand where we were, the capital tax levy in the current year is $32 million. So we're saying no more than 70% of that could be used towards debt service. We had run the models everywhere from probably 60% of that $32 million to 65, 66, 67. So the variations were small, but that's how we came up with that. And our obviously, if you've followed any of our models through the budget deliberations, our plan is continuing to increase the capital tax levy at a rate of $3 million a year in order to, keep our infrastructure going, keep the projects going we want. We know, obviously, the town's got some major projects out there, but this is all part of this is just not a model that started this year. We've started this, and it's just the next step in the process. Thank you.
Further discussion on the Simon Tarkington motion for 70%. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Aye. Abstention. 11-1-0. Are there any other motions to this policy?
Want to make it?
You want me to make it?
I'll make it.
Okay.
If I could, Mr. Chairman, when we get to the second bullet on page 2 of the draft from today, it says maintain a maximum town of Greenwich total short and long-term debt of no more than, and it says XX million dollars, which should be 210 million would be the number to insert in there.
Moved by Mr. Mason.
Second.
Second by Mr. Pellegrino. So, discussion, but before we get there, so Roland, have you worked the numbers? This then discusses if it was 210, which currently represents X dollars per capita. And
I'll tell you, it's $3,367
Yeah. 3,367?
per capita, or 0.68% of the grand list.
Okay.
0.68.
0.68% of the grand list.
That's the next figure.
Hold on.
Is that what I have, Peter? Yeah.
So, Roland, have you done this calculation? So can you do that while we have this discussion?
I did this calculation.
Well, I know you did that calculation. What do they say? Trust but verify? I just want to make sure so that we don't, we
That's
can obviously go back and correct it. And obviously the key here is getting the first number right. It's a function, it's a mathematical equation thereafter. So I'm not overly concerned about it. But in terms of when people leave here, what I don't like happening is there's misinformation out there, which is really, it's not necessarily important, but it's important that we're all on the same page. And so if we don't know the exact precise number tonight, that's okay.
I did the number on the 210. I came up with 3,367.
Okay, so you verified that. And what about as a percentage of the grand list?
We're using a population of 62,368, which is not official, but it's the best number we can come up with today.
Okay.
And percentage of grand list, have you done that number?
Do that one.
Okay, so for purposes of this discussion, we'll use the 3,367 and then the 0.68%. And that's the motion, Mr. Mason?
Roland's doing the grand list now.
Okay. All right, so discussion, Mr.
Chairman?
Mason.
Discussion, where were we discussing? Okay, so the number 210, if we go back to 3 budgets ago, we have our capital model. If we go back the budget after that, we take our commitments, we roll those forward, we take each project, we either bring them in or we move them out going forward. The model that we had this year, for those that attended any of the budget committee deliberations, when we look at our 5 and 10-year capital models, the number we had originally thought of for total debt outstanding, and I want to put a very important caveat on this. We did this in anticipation of what we would be committing when we built the models. We thought it's safe to say we're going to do MISA in 2 phases. It's safe to say that we're going to get to the firehouse not next year, but certainly the year after that. We have Nathaniel Witherell with us tonight. We anticipate that there's going to be a number plugged in for that. So as we built up models, we tried to see where we were. And one of the things that we noticed is that in the original model, in the budget 13-14, we exceeded that $200 million number that we were talking about by about, I think the number was just shy of $7 million, $6 million and change. So as much as we had run the numbers, we said, well, that wouldn't be the way to go. So obviously, I think the $210 million recognizes that keeps us within boundaries. From there, the Finance Department has offered us several different models showing us what does that mean to us. What does that mean? What does this bring forward for our community? And it basically shows everything that we've been dealing with for a long time. We have choices to make, that we are willing to live within stable and predictable taxes, that there's many different motions, that we may need to postpone a project till we pay off another project. It's all the above. We may need to raise capital tax levy. But it was fairly safe, and I can't speak for the other members, and I'm sure they will, that the $210 million seemed to work. We also, in the same document, have, and we're not editing that, but we have a relook every 2 years. I think the BET needs to look at this. I think some of the borrowings that we've done in the past, we've taken advantage of favorable interest rates. I think in the future we might look to do, depending on the first selectman, maybe some more projects with cash, whatever the case may be is. But I think 210 works for us right now. It certainly gets us, we don't want to have a debt policy that we're going to knowingly exceed, because that's not our goal. The biggest advantage to the number 210 is, I think, from an RTM point of view, all the materials that the RTM has to date on all of the budgets, it would be consistent with those. Those numbers will be consistent, so they'll be able to immediately take if we adopt this debt policy, immediately see what the impacts of the policy are going forward. And I think that's what is another highlight of the $210 million number. So I hope we support that.
Discussion on the amendment. Mr. Norton.
Mr. Chairman, in my opinion, it's absolutely essential and vitally important that when we ask the public to loan us money, which is what a debt instrument is, that we have a debt policy. And actually what a debt policy does is it imposes discipline. And I have been supporting a discipline that has a maximum of $200 million. However, I am more than willing to agree to the $210 million recommendation that has been proposed by Mr. Mason, because I think it's more important that we have a debt policy than that we quibble over a few $1 million at this point in time.
Further discussion on the amendment. Mr. Kelly.
I also believe a debt policy is very important, which is why I went with this. And I went with the $210 million after lengthy discussions, because I thought it was disingenuous of us to go with a lower number when our actual capital model shows us spending whatever the number was, Mike, 206 or 207 million. That having been said, I think it's important for the public to know that the mere fact that we're doing this 210 limit doesn't mean we may go way under. We may have to go over in certain situations, but it's a policy that we want to follow. But I don't want anybody to get comfortable we're going to spend right up to 210 million or anything like that, or go way under. It's a policy that we're hoping to follow as a BET, because we think the debt policy is important from all of our perspectives. That's all. Thanks.
Further discussion, Mr. Raymer, on the amendment.
On the amendment. It's important also for those of us who had an ethic going into the conversations at higher numbers that we rely heavily upon the principles set out in the instrument itself, that these policy guidelines, including this figure, will be reviewed periodically and no less often than every 2 years. Firm numbers have a way of becoming outdated by inflation and the passage of time. I'm sure there's many people here who can remember buying gas at 28 cents a gallon and purchasing automobiles at $2,000 a copy for a brand new automobile. I'm concerned that these figures tend to become the straitjacket that my colleagues spoke to, if not reviewed periodically. And so I repeat, I rely upon that principle laid out in the instrument itself that we'll be reviewing these figures not less often than every 2 years.
Ms. Tarkington.
That is true. There are many terms in terms of the structure of this debt policy that have been included beyond the numbers here. But I'd also like to add that while it conforms with our model, and we've all worked very hard on that over the past year or so, and we've all worked together on that, it does allow, based on our last audited financial statements, allows the town to add about 68% more debt. So there is a lot of flexibility, and when we reach this ceiling amount of $210,000, and I was one of the ones that came up in order to have this consensus, we have to acknowledge that it adds a substantial amount of debt to the town's balance sheet from where we are today.
On the motion, Mr. Campbell, and then Mr. Huffman.
Yeah, I think that that maybe it doesn't seem popular to talk about a straitjacket in association with this policy, but I think the truth is that Greenwich taxpayers are looking for some kind of a straitjacket. I think the taxpayers want some assurance that with all the debt we've gotten into and with all the debt that we will be getting into in our capital model, that there are limits. And so I certainly support this. I don't think it's materially significant whether the number is $200 or $210 million, and so I'm glad that it appears that we're able to reach consensus on the number of 210. And while I appreciate the importance of revisiting these numbers, I think every BET every year is going to revisit these numbers. I hope we're making a statement and a commitment to a debt limit here. I think that it's important that the community understands that numbers, do add up. That while, Greenwich may be able to afford anything, it can't afford everything, and certainly not at once. And I think that the adoption of this policy is really a recognition, perhaps to a greater or lesser extent on the part of all of us. Again, as Mr. Raymer, I think quite rightly said, we come at it with different perspectives, but we're able to come together on the agreement at this time on a number. And I hope that the public, while maybe they haven't all been adding up and the number might seem alarming, I hope it will act as a real limit and as something going forward that will be important when we have the CIP process and when we debate amongst ourselves what projects to fund. We're agreeing that we don't want to incur more debt than we have agreed to, that I hope we're going to agree to tonight in this policy. Thank you.
Mr. Huffman.
As many of us are aware, for many years, the town of Greenwich sailed along wildly underinvesting and maintaining its capital infrastructure. We're paying the price for that now in many regards, and as the years have passed, we've in many cases had to spend much more money than we would have had to had we made appropriate, timely investments. I don't relish the idea that we would be looking at these debt limits, but we are, and I think we should point out that this number, while it seems large in the minds of some, actually, if adhered to, will require the at least postponement, if not cancellation, of a number of capital projects that are in the existing town capital plan as anticipated to be funded and completed in future years. My own thought is that if there's a project that shouldn't be done, we ought to have the courage to identify it and get rid of it, that we shouldn't hide behind an artificial debt limit to say we won't do something that we really conclude is important, if not essential. And so I think that this is not the best way for us to go, and I cannot support this limit either.
Further discussion on the amendment? So it will read, maintain a maximum town of Greenwich total short and long-term debt of no more than $210 million, which currently represents $3,367 per capita and 0.68% of the, I'm going to add something else in here and ask you for
0.69.
0.69. It's already going up. Of the October 1st, 2010 grand list. And I would ask that if Mr. Mason and Mr. Pellegrino would agree to that to clarify what the grand list we're discussing or what is being referenced.
If I may, I would agree to that. I think it makes a specific, that's the latest date of the grand list. Am I correct, Peter?
October 1st?
Of 2010.
2010.
We'll review the BAA. I use the number at Novus calculation. So after the appeal process. It's the October 1st of each year after the appeal process.
Okay.
That's adjusted by.
You know,
But it's,
Why should you just use the word annual?
I think.
all right, we'll keep, it's the grand use list that we're using to reference the 0.69, correct?
Can I make a
All right.
point? If I may, clearly, the governing number here is the 210. It's not the grand list that's changing.
And that last one, if
Changing
we
at
need,
that moment.
if that one we need to adjust, it'll adjust.
The 210 sets for what
Okay.
the others get automatically adjusted to.
Right.
So
You want me to say it again? Does anybody need the language read again? Okay. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstention. 1101. 1110.
1-0.
Okay. So let's see. We're now back to the Mason-Norton motion for adoption of this debt policy as amended. Discussion. Okay. Question. Let me just say, once again, thank all of the members and all the committees who worked on this. And while it is true, and while it is in the statement that we will be reviewing this periodically, no less often than every 2 years, and I anticipate that this then becomes part of our policies and procedures manual, which, as you all know, would then be looked at the very least, at the appointment of the new term of a BET, and I suspect that budget committees will be looking at this in the future relative to their creation of budget guidelines and giving direction to our departments and appointing authorities. It certainly does set forth limitations that I think at least the public, even if they don't fully appreciate or comprehend the dollar amounts, can certainly ask the questions, and we can all talk about what the policy is at that time. And future BETs will be wrestling with this, as well as the effect that this has on future projects. Because make no mistake about it, this policy, as it's currently constituted, will impact those projects below the line unless we, in fact, adopt a different set of guidelines and a different set of practices going forward. Because the amount of projects that we are doing now bring us close to this level as it stands. And so the projects below the line will be scrutinized relative to this debt policy. And if the debt policy changes, that's for a future BET to determine at a later date. But as of right now, this will have the effect of impacting that capital plan or the current capital plan. Okay. All those in favor of the debt policy as amended signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstention. 11-1-0. Thank you all. The second item under old business policies and procedures discussion now comes before us. I sent out an email on Friday indicating that we will not be taking this to a vote as previously first anticipated. I had a conversation with the law department on Friday, a very good discussion, and one of the commitments that I've made to you is that you will have a law department opinion concerning some of the major items involving voting rights, tie-breaking votes when it comes to an appropriation. As a result of that conversation on Friday, it appeared to me that, in fact, there were hypothetical questions that I have heard all of you talk about, or many of you talk about, that still needed some work from the law department. So I've asked them to go back because I know that if I still had a question, it means that some of you have that same question because I got my questions from all of you. And so there's no magic to voting on that this month. And so we will also take this up in September. My hope is, and my commitment to you is to get out a draft of the policies and procedures that have been amended for wordsmithing. Some of you have produced some changes that way in the August timeframe, and then that the more macro issues are really what we're talking about in September. And by then you'll have a law department opinion concerning some of the issues that many of you have raised, and I wouldn't be surprised if the law department reaches out to you individually to follow up on some of the questions that I had asked. Mr. Finger.
The Policies and Procedures Committee has received comments from 2 members of this board, and I'd ask if there's any other members that would like to submit comments, wordsmithing comments, substantive comments, if they would please do so. And I defer to the chair whether he prefers that they send it to the Policies and Procedures Committee itself, that being myself and Joe Pellegrino, or send it to Elaine Brown and Peter Monarski for forwarding to us. It doesn't matter to us. But
I prefer it just to go to Elaine, because Elaine at least can push it back out to everybody so that everyone's not recreating the wheel on some of these. But I would, and as I've indicated, I know it's a hefty document, but to the extent that even if it's just your issue or your committee or your whatever, make changes to that and send them in.
Okay, and Joe and I have met twice since the last BET meeting as we continue to discuss issues, try to refine points that are in the policies and procedures, that issues that have come up on our own further review, but also from the review of the several members that have commented.
Thank you. Mr. Norton?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, if we are on new business, I'd like to make a motion.
Your motion, Mr. Norton?
Our motion is to consider the OPEB Trust Board representative appointments as the next item.
Okay. It's a motion to take the second item under new business out of order. Is there a second? Second by Mr. Finger. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Abstention. 12-0-0. Mr. Norton?
Mr. Chairman, at the Investment Advisory Committee meeting this morning, and subject to the discussion at that meeting and a vote of 3-0, I have 2 recommendations to make, and that is first, the result that this committee reappoints William V. Ferdinand to a term on the OPEB Trust Board to expire June 30, 2014, and further resolved that this committee and the Board of Estimate and Taxation reappoints Robert Stricker of the OPEB Board to serve as chairman of that for another term to end June 30, 2012. And on behalf of the committee, I so move.
Second.
Moved by Mr. Norton, second by Mr. Pellegrino. Discussion? All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstention. 12-0-0. I know we sort of rushed through that to get to HDG, but certainly the work of Mr. Stricker and Mr. Ferdinand is recognized, and they have done yeoman's work to the town of Greenwich, and I think that's evidenced in the performance of the OPEB fund and the fact that it's been an absolute smooth process as this relatively new fund moves along. So please extend our thanks to them for their service.
Yes, I will, Mr. Chairman, and just to report that in the fiscal year ending June 30th, we had more than a 20% increase in the OPEB Trust Fund.
Great, thank you. Okay. New business now, Health Dimensions Group, the consultant that was selected in order to review the revised Project Renew. I never know really what term Nathaniel Witherell uses, if they just use Project Renew or revised Project Renew. Are you going to be using the screen up here?
No, it's up to you. We don't have to. If we want to go by the handouts.
It's up to you. If you want it, that's fine. Well,
I can just stand here and present at the podium if it's.
Okay.
And if you want it can be on behind me if that
I just
Fair
think
enough.
it might be easier because we have a lot of people.
Does the board want to take 2 minutes? Do you want to just jump right in? Jump right in? Okay. I know that the BET received an extra copy. We received the color copy in our packet, and then we received another copy today. So we have, I mean, I know I can turn mine in for the audience.
They're different. That's the presentation.
They're
That's
different.
30 slides. The blue copy is
Got
the
it.
report of 45 pages.
All right, and so do we have enough for the audience if
Yes, I
who's
do.
ever interested? Okay. Got it. Okay, so while everyone's sort of getting together, let me just tee this up more for the audience and for people listening. So after it was obvious that Project Renew, as it was first defined, was not going to proceed, there was no CON issued. Nathaniel Witherell went back and revised Project Renew. We then engaged HDG again to look at the business plan surrounding the revised Project Renew. And as a result of your analysis relative to this revised Project Renew, you're here now. And while we met originally for a kickoff, we have not met since then because of our short time frame. And so we're now getting this report for the first time, and then it's our process to then take the analysis that you give us, question and answers, what have you, hear from Nathaniel Witherell, to then hopefully take this to a vote at our September meeting, to then hopefully turn it over to the RTM in the September, October timeframe, so that final resolution on revised Project Renew can occur within this calendar year. And I know that's not necessarily something you have to address, but I just want to make sure everybody understands how we got to where we are and why you're standing before us tonight. So thank you for coming here. I know you guys fly in from all parts, right? Midwest, I believe.
Chicago and Minneapolis.
And so I'll turn it over to you, Tom
Okay,
Stitt.
well, good evening, and thank you very much for having us here to present our preliminary findings on the review of the revised LRP. And I do want to stress the word preliminary because there's some work that we still need to do over the next couple of weeks. And as you'll find out, there's a lot of uncertainty with some key assumptions with what's going on in Washington and in the state of Connecticut with Medicare, Medicaid. But my name's Tom Stitt of Health Dimensions Group, and my colleague Mary Nell Zellner is here with me. Just to, again, briefly go through the scope, we were engaged to do an independent and objective appraisal of the revised LRP to look at the reasonableness of the assumptions of the revenues and expenses based on our experience. And this is, as Steve mentioned, our third go-around here. 8 years ago, we looked at the original CON documents, and last year we presented or wrapped up a report in early part of 2010 on the previous version of the LRP. And this is the revised LRP review here. I'm going to go through the key findings. The reason why you have two reports, the first report that was sent out on Friday is a more detailed version of our report, and I wanted to condense it for purposes of this meeting so that we can touch on the highlights and have more time with discussion. 30-year projections are it's extremely difficult to prepare. There's 5-year projections are difficult to prepare, and in this day and age, 1-year projections is difficult with all the economic uncertainty. So I do understand and appreciate the effort that Nathaniel Witherell staff and board has gone through to prepare these financial projections. We did our work in 3 phases. First thing was construction, then we looked at the revenues, and then the expense assumptions. I'm going to touch on some of the highlights here. The construction budget assessment. We have very limited and preliminary data to work with at this point. So therefore, we did a high-level review on what was provided to us. And in general, the overall budget is reasonable and obtainable. But again, we just don't have enough information. And from what I understand, they're in the process of updating the architectural drawings and construction estimates. And I'm not sure what the timeline of that is, but when those are completed, we can certainly do a review of the final information. So at this point in time, we have not made any kind of recommendation on construction costs. The next phase is reviewing the projected revenues. The first step in this review is performing a market area and demand analysis. And the goal of this is to determine the demand for the short-term Medicare Part A and commercial patients, as well as the need for long-term care beds in the area. Our findings include the 2011 census of 29 represents approximately 18.5% of the capture rate of potential admissions from the two primary referring hospitals. The LRP includes a 44-bed short-term unit. To support that unit would require approximately 25% capture rate, which is a 35% increase in the capture rate from today. On the long-term care side, there's an unmet demand of 103 beds approximately in 2011. In 2016, that number goes down to 42 because there's currently some trends of decreasing utilization as more home and community-based services come into play. But when we have a report specifically for this that we will share with you after this meeting when we pull together our next report. So how we use that in our analysis when we look at payer mix, the LRP assumes that the Medicare and commercial census will increase to 47 patients after the renovations. And we believe that will be a challenge to get to that level, which represents a 62% increase in your Medicare and commercial payer types. Again, that's a 35% increase in capture rate, a 62% increase in census. And in addition to that, you would need to maintain 8 Medicare patients in your long-term care unit. So our recommendation at this point is to model the long-range plan with no more than 40 commercial and Medicare A. That should be Medicare and commercial patients, totaling 40. So the 7 in our revised financials, we have allocated the 7 to Medicaid and private pay. We also think it's important to prepare a formal written marketing plan to demonstrate how Nathaniel Witherell can achieve the payer mix of 40 to 47 Medicare Part A's and commercials. I think that's important so that there's a plan in place. The next section is on our revenue projections. Looking at the private pay rates, we made some adjustments to account for some changes in the timing of rate increases that was recently approved. And we've made some adjustments to estimates for conversion of balcony and quad rooms to semi-privates. And then we also, for the commercial rate, we recommend that you increase the assumption in the LRP to the actual 2011 average rate of $424. These items represent a positive change in the financial results in the long-range plan. And I'm going to go through the impact of these at the end of the presentation. Medicaid revenues. I've got a lot of information here on that. The first recommendation that we are making to use the current rate as the baseline for 2011, the $243.42. It's a slight change. The inflation factors are listed on the slide, 1%, 1.5%, and 2% over the next 3 years, and then 2.25% going forward to the end of the 30-year period. The state currently has proposed a rate increase effective July 1 of 11, which has not been approved yet from what I understand, of 3.77%, and then a 0.33% increase in 2013, state fiscal year 2013. This is, there's been rate freezes for the last couple of years, so again, this hasn't been approved yet, but I think we recommend changing the LRP to these numbers, and then we'll just keep an eye out on it over the next couple of weeks to see if that does come through. Looking at beyond 2014, it's almost impossible to predict as far as inflation factors. You're going to have some years where there's rate freezes like we've had. You probably have some years where you actually get market basket increases. So I think for the purposes of the LRP, the assumptions that are in there are reasonable. However, I think a sensitivity analysis should be run on a 1% annual inflation from 2014 to 2038, just so that you can see what the cash flow implications are. Fair rental value is a material issue in the renovation or project renew. It's a way that the state reimburses for capital expenses. The keys here are the amount that the state approves, which we know is $12 million, and the rate of return at the time the renovations are completed. The assumption in the LRP is a 5% rate of return. The current 2010 rate was 4.44, and the 2009 rate was 4.52. The 10-year average is 6.36. So there's been a little bit of a declining trend that could change. So I think for purposes of the LRP, we agree with the calculation of the $13.74 increase that was done. The formula used is consistent with the formula that the state of Connecticut uses. Again, the final rate will depend on the rate of return in 2015 when the project is completed. So I think a recommendation that we have is to use a 4% rate of return as a sensitivity analysis to see what the impact would be with a lower rate of return. Then there's also an adjustment that needs to be made to add back the differential that you're currently receiving because you're lower than the 25th percentile. There's a $1.55 difference that should be added or should be deducted, from the fair rental value amount. Medicare Part A. This is one of the big issues right now. This is the biggest issue. The proposed legislation issued in May of 2011 could have significant impact on the cash flow projections. CMS has proposed two options. It's kind of a good news and bad news. Option number one is an increase of 1.5%, which is the market basket of 2.7 less a productivity adjustment of 1.2. Option number two is quite different. It's a reduction of 11.3%, and it's due to unexpected spikes in payments from last year. It's called the parity adjustment. The spike in payments last year was due to the transition to a new case mix adjusted RUG-4 model, which basically determines the per diem rates. The final rate is due out August 1st and is effective October 1st. So the adjustment could be anywhere from a negative 11% to a positive 1.5%. The American Healthcare Association released their opinion and comments, and they actually support CMS's effort to recover the overpayments, but have proposed a multi-year phase-in rather than a one-time adjustment. Based on CMS's history with other payment systems, looking into my crystal ball, I would guess that it would be a multi-year phase-in. They typically have done a phased-in approach instead of a one-time hit like this. So if you look at the 2011 rate of $541, that's a 9.4% increase from 2010. That's because of this parity adjustment, the change to the new RUG model. It wasn't anything that Nathaniel Witherell did. It just happens that it wasn't a budget neutral change, and you got paid 9.4% more. CMS wants to take that back. The inflation factors in the model, we believe, need to be adjusted. What I'm recommending right now is a 1.5% reduction for the next 4 years, 2012 through 2015, which would allow CMS to take back the overpayments that they had, yet they would take that back by reducing the standard market basket increase. Okay. Sorry, Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services. And this whole issue is in the middle of the debt ceiling debate in Washington right now too. So it's really hard to tell what's going to happen there, but we should know on August 1st. They have to have a rule out on August 1st. Currently, this is our recommendation. It could change in 2 weeks. The LRP also has a $24 improvement or increase based on some improvements in Medicare coding and documentation practices that we did identify back when we did our previous review, and then you also had another outside firm support that as well. We agree that there is opportunity there, and we agree that should happen, but we recommend that you do a sensitivity analysis on that as well in case you do not realize those improvements. So that's the revenue side. The expense side, we agree with the inflation factors that have been used in the model, 2.5% to 3% for most things. And again, it's really difficult to predict what's going to happen going beyond 5 years. But I think the assumptions are reasonable. Mary Nell will address the staffing
pieces. Hello, and thank you for inviting us. The next table, page 16 on your slides, represents the 2015 adjustments of an increase in staff based on the conclusion of the construction project. And you can see that it's a relatively modest increase of 2.1 FTEs or full-time equivalents for housekeeping based on more private rooms and more staff needed to adjust to those spaces. 3.3 FTEs for the rehab nurses on the short stay unit, which is, I'll speak to that in a moment, and then actually starting next year, a 0.6 or about a half-time FTE for social services. And looking at the staffing model, there's not drastic changes or huge increases that occur because of the project renewal. There are some recommendations, however, that we made based on the staffing models provided. One piece is to review the director of admissions position. There are presently, and also to support people that are presently in-house. We'd recommend that when you have a short stay unit, you have a dedicated, highly skilled, typically it's a nurse, admissions director, discharge planner, that is able to function and handle that high volume of short stay admissions and discharges. Also, the changes, there are not significant changes in the RN staffing related to complete the MDS 3.0, or the MDS is the minimum data set. That started in October 1st of 2010 is when 3.0 kicked in, and it requires substantially more RN time in clinical reimbursement RNs to be able to complete that assessment, and it drives your revenue stream. It's a highly important position in your organization. So one of the pieces that we've recommended is an have an external review of your clinical process to ensure that you're fully capturing your accurate coding. And that was one piece that we did look at in 2009, that we noted that there was a significant amount of money being left on the table related to coding with 2.0, and nobody's looked at your 3.0 impact. And a number of organizations are looking at that now because we've had 6 months to look at what the impact has been to your organization. So that'd be one piece to look at. In our 2009 study, DART, which is an external coding company, had been in the process of looking at doing an implementation strategy for Nathaniel Witherell, and that has been delayed and has not occurred yet due to some computer conversion issues. MDI is the computer software that's being used at the facility now. So at this point, the facility has not realized the capture of that revenue that we identified in 2009, that DART, who is your external organization, thought that they could capture in addition. So that contract has not been engaged, and so therefore there could be more revenue pieces that we cannot quantify right now. Presently, your staffing is documented at 3.9 productive nursing hours per day, which is garnering the facility a 4-star rating out of a 5-star rating, which is a positive. That affects your a consumer review of your operations, and it's in a healthy range. It's not a 2-star or 1-star, which is, of course, a giant red flag. Also, in terms of 2015, there are some projected recommendations that we make for your clinical staff. While the staff has done a good job in identifying more need of skilled RNs, you should be looking also at your nursing assistant ratio in your short stay unit as well, because those higher acuity patients need more hands-on care. So one piece is your staffing volume looks appropriate. There might be some changes in terms of shifting of units after you on the final version. So we don't recommend more staff, but again, looking at the acuity levels related to your MDS, you should flux your staff in order to accommodate that short stay unit. Health and benefits.
Employee benefits, as they're running about 39% of salaries. This is a challenge that Nathaniel Witherell has compared to some competitors, the private sector. As you can see in the last bullet point on that page, the average is 20 to 25% benefits as a percentage of salary. So it's something that it represents a big challenge going forward, especially with cuts in reimbursement. Short-term resident variable costs. The first recommendation in this category is that we use 2011 final financial data. Actually, that recommendation goes across all areas. I think if we can use the final 2011 numbers as our basis going forward, it'll be a more valuable report. The LRP did not have any annual inflation factors for this expense category, and it resulted in a significant understatement of expenses over the 30-year period, as I'll point out when we get to the impacts. So we need to we've applied those inflation factors. Medicaid user fee. This is attached to that Medicare or Medicaid rate increase that I was talking about earlier. It basically offsets what they're giving you on the revenue side. You know, they're taking this back for the non-Medicare patients. So this, again, has not been finalized, but they are looking at increasing the user fees effective this year and next year. The next slide, debt service. The $23.8 million of debt. The LRP had the principal running through the cash flow, the principal payments on that debt, but the interest expense was not coming through. So that resulted in a significant understatement of the expenses. So the capital financing model and the subsidy requirement should be revisited when we get close to finalizing this report. The impact of the recommendations. I did the same actually as I did the last time. we looked at the impact on the cumulative 30-year financial projections by, first of all, calculating the baseline, which was the board-approved LRP from March. We eliminated the fundraising piece and the town subsidy so that we could identify what is the true gap, that cash flow gap that we need to fill. We calculated the impact on net income and cash flow for each recommendation, and we then applied those impacts to the baseline to come up with what our gap is. We have not done the final bullet on that slide yet, but it will be in the final report. On the next table, there's some definitions. Cash flow is defined as the cumulative 30-year cash flow. Cash need is basically the low point during that 30 years. It really represents the gap needed to be filled by town subsidy or fundraising dollars. This chart on slide 25 shows the financial impact of our preliminary recommendations. So the baseline LRP showed cash flow of $20.6 million, and I'm focusing on the two columns on the far right of the page. Eliminating the fundraising dollars that were included of $7.4 million gives us a baseline cash flow of $13.2 million, and the gap needed, the cash needed to prevent any negative cash flow during that year was $4.6 million. So you can see some big numbers on the recommended changes. The payer mix, bringing the Medicare down to 40, has an estimated impact of $15 million. The private pay, negative impact. The private pay rate has a positive impact of $25 million. Commercial was a positive change. The Medicaid rate was a positive change of $5.8 million, but down below it was offset by the Medicaid user fee of $6.2 million. So those were washes. The two biggest line items here are the Medicare Part A rates. And again, this we'll know more in 2 weeks when they come out with their final rule. But if they take 11.3% either this year or over the course of the next four years, it'll have a significant impact on the cash flow projections in this model. $36 million is the impact, the way that I've proposed, with the 1.5% reduction over the next 4 years. The lack of inflation factor on the short-term resident expenses was resulted in an understatement of $32 million over the 30-year period. And then the interest expense was $11.5 million. So as you can see right now, there's some big negative numbers in there. Currently, with these recommended changes, the cash flow number for the 30-year period is negative $51 million, and it does not achieve a break even during that period. So the conclusions are, basically, we have to keep our fingers crossed on this, on the Medicare rate issue, because the numbers are well into the negatives right now. Again, we still have some things that we're going to look at. It's a $50 million hole that needs to be filled with these recommendations. So if CMS comes through with their threats to reduce the rates, then the next step would be to look at other ways to improve the financial operations, which would be, if there's anything to do on the private pay side, looking at the staffing model and wage structure and benefits packages for efficiencies on the cost side. We have not looked at cost efficiencies yet in the LRP, but assuming that you have a renovated facility or a new facility, there should be some efficiencies on the utilities and maintenance side. And then the town department expenses was another area that we looked at. So our next steps after today is to obtain feedback for these preliminary findings. wait until August 1st to find out what's happening with Medicare. Keep an eye on the state of Connecticut, on those rate increases and what's going on with reimbursement here in the state. Look at the revised construction estimates and review any potential for cost efficiencies. We did not revise the LRP to include some new union contracts. That needs to be incorporated. And then also incorporate the 2011 financial data where we can. And then prepare and deliver the final report. So that concludes the presentation, and we can take some questions now.
Okay, hold on. So I know Nathaniel Witherell wanted to speak. I don't know if you want to speak after the question and answer session or before. I'll leave that up to you. Okay. And so we'll proceed as I have mentioned to some of you. Obviously tonight, unlike last time where we had the ability of our team to work with you before the final report, and I know that was useful, at least from our end. And yes, while this is a follow-up to that, it still requires the same type of analysis. So we don't have the luxury of that this time. So there might be some more specific questions, although I'd ask the board that we do intend to take this report, meet again with the special project team, Nathaniel Witherell, our friends on the RTM who are the representatives, to dive deeper into some of the more specifics. So tonight we'd like to sort of keep it on a very macro basis to give you some things to think about or questions or answers, because obviously our goal still is to make a decision in September. And so with that, let me open it up. Mr. Raymer?
On the note of looking for some specifics as we go forward to help us make some of these decisions, there's a couple of things that occur to me that might be quite helpful. The last time that you did the study, what was your second study, or the one that precedes this, you had year-by-year figures where we could see the cash flows. I heard you say, Mr. Stitt, in your verbal presentation just now that there were no years in which we were in a positive cash flow by your projections, but neither in this nor in the slightly larger handout that we received earlier on did I see any year-by-year figures. Is it possible that you could give us, based upon your projections, year-by-year figures so that we could be looking to see what's the depth of the shortfalls and where they occur? Because we'll have a natural tendency to rely a little more on the accuracy of the ones that are in the near years and less of an inclination to do it in the out years. Is that something you could put together for us?
Yeah, no doubt. I have the LRP that I use to make my changes, and I have the monthly cash flow statement that I can provide to you like I did last time.
I have a second one that may be outside of what you've been able to do, but I'm going to try you out on it anyway, if I may. I saw in some of your earlier pages in both of these handouts that you're talking about the capture rate, and you're making judgments about the percentages of the discharges from the hospital on the short-term and private pay patients and the like. It may be that part of our judgments, or maybe at least for me anyway, part of the judgment I'll be making has something to do with the extent to which running this facility meets the needs of this particular town in being able to take care of the long-term Medicaid patients. I gather we're housing in the facility presently about 100 or 110 Medicaid patients. I'm not sure if I have that quite right, that are on long-term beds. Is it any part of your study for you to have a sense of what is the total need in the town to have an ability to house Medicaid patients? Do you have data like that? Because I, for one, might benefit from knowing from you or from some source what exactly is the need in town to have a facility that takes Medicaid patients.
Yeah, we have in our market and demand analysis that you will be receiving a separate, it will be an appendix to our report, but we'll give you that in advance over the next week or so, so you can see our calculations, and it breaks down the number of beds by facility in the area, and it calculates the bed need for long-term care patients, which is 102, I believe, on page 5, 103 long-term care beds. So we do have our calculations behind that. We'll share that with you.
Further questions, Mr. Mason?
On your charts where you're showing the total cash needed over the period, everything that I've seen so far, as far as Project Renew, there's an initial hurdle why construction's going on, where there'd be a possible reduction in revenues. Is this number just total package, or are you including that as in your buildup?
That includes the entire 30-year period beginning 2000, I think it's 2010 actually, through 2039.
So
it does include the construction period where there is that dip in census.
So it would be helpful to see what the impacts are,
For the construction date.
for the construction
Yep.
period.
And we, in looking at that preliminarily, we agreed with the assumptions that were used during that period as far as census. The revenue changes will definitely have a negative impact on that, and it will cause a deeper deficit than what you had in the LRP.
Right. So if you have a true 51, let's call it 51 million, that's predicated over a year, but it's got to be preloaded in the first couple, 3 years.
Well, it's more significant in during that construction period, yes, than it would be going forward. Once you get your stabilized census after the construction period, then you have a more stabilized margin.
One piece, just in terms of the construction, typically we looked at an 8 to 10, I think, is our figure, 8 to 10% dip in census with construction. It certainly can be. With a really tight management, you can perhaps work around that, and we've had discussion with facility staff about that because that's normal. But if there are some feelings, a little controversy between our opinion and the facility. It's feasible, but it would be difficult to not have a census drop.
Mr. Simon, Mr. Kelly, Ms. Tarkington.
Yeah. I'm concerned. You've listed a lot of concerns in the Medicare program, but I'm also concerned about the Medicaid program, both at the federal level and at the state level. In your experience across the country or where you do work, do you find people postponing construction of new nursing homes or opening new facilities due to the uncertainty of the reimbursement environment?
I would say, and you can help me out here, but it's slowed down definitely in the last few years. There was a phase several years ago where we were looking at a lot of replacement facility projects. Haven't had that volume recently, for sure.
And do you think that's due to the uncertainties present in the market due to the reimbursements?
I think it's a combination of reimbursement uncertainty as well as economic conditions that organizations don't have the funds that they may have had 10 years ago, just due to what's happened with the economy. That's my opinion.
I can speak to a number of projects that I've been involved in that, it's going to sound odd, but with the housing market, one of the pieces that's happened with kind of marginal and also certainly medical assistance individuals is if a child has lost their house, they move in with mom or dad, and their house has been foreclosed upon, and they don't go into the nursing home because they're caring for their elderly. And that has happened in many markets where housing has really crashed. The assisted living complexes and skilled buildings have seen a significant shift in their admission rates because of those housing situations. It certainly might not be an issue in Greenwich, but it has been an issue nationally that has changed the construction of senior housing.
Yeah. Yep.
Mr. Kelly.
I note that you're talking about doing sensitivity analysis at page 17, 19, and 22. Are you going to perform those?
Yeah, we will with the final report. We did last time. We just haven't done that for this. But we will have our baseline recommendations like we present here, and then the sensitivity analyses below the line, so to speak, to show you what the impact would be if for those.
Well, then you'll give us your
Pardon me?
opinion also on the sensitivity analysis.
Opinion on the sensitivity as far as
Well, you're going to test whether the numbers that we're looking at are reasonable based on the sensitivity analysis that you do, right? I mean, we're not just going to do a sensitivity analysis and put those under a footnote. I assume you're going to give us an opinion.
we're going to give you, our opinion will be in our baseline recommendation.
Okay.
For some issues that are a little bit uncertain, for example, Medicaid rate increases. We believe what was used in the LRP was reasonable. But when I do financial projections, I want to know what the worst case scenario is.
Right.
That's one issue. That's one thing that we would do that for. Same with the other ones. The Medicare rate increase, we believe that should happen, but we believe you also should know what it will look like if it doesn't happen.
Right, I want that, but I also, at the end of the day, I want your opinion with respect to where you think it's going to go, just like you've started to give us tonight.
That's what anything with recommendations in it
Right.
is our opinion.
Okay.
And then some of them will be, will also have sensitivity analyses on worst case scenario or base case scenario if that's the case.
Right, but at the end of the day, I don't want an opinion and then a caveat with the sensitivity analysis. I want you to include the sensitivity analysis and then come up with an opinion, considering the sensitivity.
Yeah, I think our opinions were pretty well defined in the report as far as what we recommend.
Right, I just see sensitivity analysis 3 times, and I get concerned because I want your opinion at the end of the day.
Okay.
Okay.
Ms. Tarkington.
Yes, on the staffing changes that you have here, is this related to the expanded rehab unit from 29 to 44 persons, or are you also including in here that the Witherall will be moving from 5 units to 6 units with 2 rehab units? So does this take in? I'm sorry?
It's the first assumption.
It's the first assumption. It's not moving to an additional unit. It's not included. The second question I have is the debt numbers you're using here, do they include the debt that's already borrowed as well as obviously what they're projecting? And also, have you substituted debt for the fundraising when you removed the fundraising? And so how have you funded the operation? Is that additional debt that you've added in there?
No, not currently. The only debt that's in there is for the new construction. Well, if there is, I have to look and see what the current existing debt is and how it's in the LRP.
There's $2.2 million of long.
$2.2 million in the existing debt that has already been spent, amortized interest on it.
Okay.
So the 2.2 is there, but when you removed the fundraising, you didn't substitute debt.
No, because we're trying to identify how much debt you need. Hopefully, in best case scenario, that number would be very small and could be filled by fundraising, not debt. At the end of the day, we're going to come up with that bottom line number that needs to fill the gap, and you'll have to determine what the source of that is, whether it's external financing or fundraising.
In structuring your debt for the repayments here, how did you structure it? Is on a 20-year amortizing basis?
Yeah, this was a 20-year amortization at 5% interest.
And so is the debt fully amortized in approximately, say, 22 to 23 years?
It's 20 years.
No, I understand 20 years, but there's a construction period when you'd have the 2-year notes. So I'm trying to figure out how far out is it before, on your 30 years, how far out do you go? Is it 24 years or whatever, until the debt is fully amortized?
25 years, I believe, is the way it's set up, that we roll in the construction period interest into the debt,
Right.
and then it's 20 years from post-construction to, I believe, 2025. Is that right, Ray? Yeah.
So just sort of taking, does it make sense, just sort of rather than having a 30-year long-range plan here, to have, say, maybe a 25-year long-range plan? Would you make a recommendation one way or another?
I thought of that. I did think of that, and it may be something to consider. If it's, yeah.
Okay.
And I'll let you know what, we'll think about that again.
Yeah, and I think it would be interesting to see what the numbers look like on that shorter 25-year period versus the 30-year period, because it's already a struggle to go out 25 years.
Yes.
Thank you.
Pellegrino.
Tom, I'd like to stay very high level, and I'd ask you to step back from your report for a moment. What does this project buy me? What is $50 million subsidy from the town buying me? Do you want to think about that for a moment? I'll give you some other thoughts. So if you're an advisor to me, and suppose I own this facility, what would you advise me? Would you tell me to put up $50 million to take on this project?
I would not, unless there's other reasons beyond the financial issues. $50 million is, it doesn't have cash flow. I mean, I don't think anybody would invest in a business that never has positive cash flow. But then it gets back to mission and whether or not that's worth $50 million.
Let's step away from mission. I just want to understand the project. I want to understand what it's buying me. And is there another way to go about doing this? Is there another way to be thinking about this that meets the needs of the town or the people who use the facility?
Well, I think,
but not have to spend $50 million?
Well, one of the things that I mentioned in the presentation is with these economic uncertainties and the reimbursement uncertainties, you're at a competitive disadvantage to other private securizations that have lower cost structures. I don't know if there's much you can do about it. So that's a hurdle that you have to get around no matter what, even with normal reimbursement. And I think you've done a good job of balancing the budget over the last 5 or 6 years or whatever. I think it's been a tremendous job. So, but things are going to get hard for Nathaniel Witherell and for every other facility in the country. If things keep going the way that they are right now. So, yeah, I mean, you have to look at other options. And, if this number is $50 million at the end of the day, then I think, it's going to be hard to say it's, worth going through with,
Part of those pieces, I think you bring up a good point. Part of those pieces are really the value of what this entity brings to your community. Whether you want to support that or look at other opportunities, whether it's a JV or some other approach. But it's one that many municipalities are looking at. I would say in this, your question about 5 years ago versus 2 years, where's our work coming now? Our work is coming from exactly what your group is looking at. Should we be in this business? Is this what our town should be doing or our county should be doing? And state government is looking at this has been a heavy issue nationally for municipalities.
I just want to, what I'm also really trying to get at is what am I getting for my money? That's a really major question here. And the question I have then, is this the only way to go about doing that, or are there more economic ways of providing the service, having the skilled facility in our community, and not have to be putting up $50 million?
I don't want to necessarily look at this through rose-colored glasses, but a comment you just made about how there's going to be this crunch, and I think you do recognize the fact that Nathaniel Witherell has done an excellent job over the last several years in terms of managing its costs, even with the collective bargaining agreements that it has. And then you proceeded to say, though, that even nationally there's going to be a lot of pain being felt on all of these types of facilities. So what's your very macro view on this industry? I mean, if we're not alone in this, we might be alone in terms of being a municipality, at least in this region, but certainly we're the exception relative to municipalities versus private sector, or then maybe county or statewide basis. But is your projection then that this industry undergoes a material or drastic change to where either services diminish, beds are eliminated nationwide, and there are no longer long-term facilities, and it's all at-home care with very small institutions?
Well, I'll let you address that, but I will say that there has been a trend, as I mentioned before, the decreasing utilization of long-term care beds. Has been a trend and a push for more home and community-based options, like a PACE program or home health and other types of programs. So, yeah, definitely, it's.
I mean, the trending is. Not that there'll be an elimination of skilled care, because there's going to be a need for the high acuity skilled care, the short stay. That doesn't dissolve because of funding issues. But as a nation, and whether you look at the state or the nation, either when you look at what's happening with our revenue, the money isn't there to support the volume of care and services that has been provided. And state governments are looking at it just as well as federal government of what we can. Where can we shave? And it's coming in fees being enhanced, and it's driving the people out of the market. There have been, in terms of facility closures nationally, or downsizing, and then opening up, diversification to other senior products, other senior services. That has been the direction of the nation. And so we've seen a number of buildings that have, shrunk their. The Medicaid piece is an important question. That Mr. Raymer brought up is, how do we care for our Medicaid population as well? But that is substantially declined, where other senior housing that can support their senior care, the SNF care, they've built assisted livings to fund the skilled services because of the cost, the losses that have happened under skilled care. And that's been a trend for the last 5 to 10 years.
And at the same time, the population is aging rapidly, which, the number of people out there that need long-term care services is not going to diminish. It's just the options may be different.
Mr. Kelly?
I just want to follow up on Joe's question. I thought it was excellent with respect to that. What are we getting for and that's it for tonight. That's the only compliment you're getting. For the $50 million, and I don't want to expand the RFP or the work that they're doing, but I think that if they could possibly give us some short addendum as to, that you have the knowledge about the trends in the industry, an addendum to this report. Because we are all on this board and out here struggling with issues involving parents and what do we do? Do we keep them at home? Do we send them to a facility? What type of facility? And it's a changing landscape, every day as to what's best and what's available. People have had to cobble together various scenarios to make it work. And I guess from you, the experts, I guess I'd like, just something. What are other possibilities out there? You were saying it much better, but I mean, I just wanted to follow up that I think that's an important issue to look at, but not to open up the whole process again, but just as some sort of supplement. If you could do that, that would be terrific to us.
The trend,
Yeah.
Part of the questions that are being asked today not only are for HDG, but for the committee.
Okay.
To take in, to then when we sit down to see, what other information that we need, does it fit within the RFP? If it doesn't, do we amend it? I mean, I heard you, and so I know you understand the process, but
Right.
we'll take it all in when we meet with Nathaniel Witherell, HDG, via phone.
Okay.
And I certainly hear what you're saying.
Good, and hopefully Elaine can interpret that.
Further questions, Mr. Raymer?
I wonder if I could add a third question to the questions that I asked before. If we were not meeting the need in this community for long-term Medicaid beds, do you have data available to you that would suggest whether or not there's alternative facilities in the community to meet that need? Is that also a question you can answer?
Other nursing facilities?
If there were no Nathaniel Witherell, if you were to identify for us that there is a need in this community for X Medicaid long-term beds, I guess the corollary question that I neglected to ask before is, and if there were no Nathaniel Witherell, are there other facilities in the general area or local area, I'm not sure which words to pick, that would pick up that need and service that need if we weren't servicing it? Do you have the ability to answer that question?
We can look at the other facilities. And there's part of that in the market.
In our market and demand analysis, which another one of our colleagues is the expert at, the demographic and market stuff. But within that, we have all of the facilities, the number of beds that they have, their a census for Medicaid, private pay, and so forth. So I do believe we could provide you with that as part of our report that breaks down probably the calculation that gets to that 102 bed need.
But who else could?
Who else? And who could absorb that, if anybody?
Thank you.
Okay. When do you think that it would be appropriate to meet with our committee? I heard you say the August 1st is when you expect a decision from CMS. So, but also on appreciating our time frame by which we have our meeting, which is mid-September. Obviously, having additional time beforehand to digest the final report. Are we thinking sort of early August?
Well, okay, there's a couple things in play. I think if you want to meet about this report before what happens in Washington, we can do that within the next 2 weeks. After the final rule is issued August 1st, I will know that day.
But your final rule has a major impact on this. I mean, those are the two biggest items that you referenced, 30 and 36 million or something of that nature. I mean, you're talking about monumental shifts, and not that all the other questions aren't important, but depending on that decision, at least in the short term, or how you view this.
I would recommend I would recommend that maybe we regroup within the first after the first, maybe within the first 10 days of August, whatever's convenient for you. Find out what's going on with Medicare rates. The other piece is, what do you want us to do with the construction piece? Is there going to be information that you would like us to review? And if so, when would that data be available? Will we have time to do that before you make your decision in September? Because I think that's important too.
We did not have sizable changes in the construction changes, so we don't have, in our opinions, strong data to give you opinions. The revisions are still, so we don't know what the timetable is for that to be reworked.
Fair enough. Okay. David, do you wish to make some comments?
Yes.
Please. Chairman of Nathaniel Witherell, David Ormsby. Good evening.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the BET. I'm joined, as always, by Alan Brown, our Executive Director, Ray Augustine, our CFO, Lloyd Bankson, Chairman of the Finance Committee, and Thomas Sicardi, who is a board member and the Chairman of our Person-Centered Care Committee. Sorry. Wrong row. David Ayers also. Before I turn to the HDG report and some observations that we have on it, we will be reporting our full 2011 fiscal results at our board meeting next Monday night. And our operations have resulted in a $208,000 net profit this year after expenses charged to Witherell by the town for information technology, for accounting, for legal, for human resources. This is our fourth consecutive year of profitability. It is not an easy task to accomplish. Our total occupancy for the year was 92.5% of capacity compared to a budget of 95%, and last year's occupancy of 93.2%. Incidentally, our occupancy today and for the current month to date is back up at 95%, which is in our long-range plan and in our budgets a target for us. The payor mix that contributed to the profitability included for the fiscal year just ended 25% private pay, 2% commercial insurance, 60% Medicaid, and 13% Medicare. Relentless attention to expenses was also important to our profitable operations. The Nathaniel Witherell continues to enjoy a Medicare 5-star rating, and we are the only Medicare 5-star rated nursing home in the Greenwich-Stanford area that accepts Medicaid residents. But turning to the HDG report, I haven't had a chance to read the shorter version, which was distributed this evening, but I did see the longer version, which was distributed a day or so ago. I was gratified to see the number of times that HDG concurred in the reasonableness of the assumptions on which our long-range plan was based. I was embarrassed, however, to have two mistakes which infected the long-range plan pointed out to us. One is the short-term or the omission on short-term expenses for an inflation factor. The other was in the process of going from iteration to iteration was the omission of the interest on the debt incurred. We will obviously make the required changes. I think the remainder of the differences between our long-range plan and its results and the HDG criticism, if you will, involve subjects upon which reasonable men and women can differ. I would suggest to you that the senior staff of Nathaniel Witherell, with an aggregate of more than 70 years of experience in operating a nursing home, in this town, in this market, and with the characteristics of Nathaniel Witherell, ought to be given the benefit of the doubt on some issues such as the wide variance in payor mix, which is suggested by our long-range plan and HDG's comments. In addition, I think a board that has managed to operate Nathaniel Witherell for 4 consecutive years on a profitable basis, and the disciplines that are implicated in accomplishing that ought to stand for something in trying to figure out how effectively we're going to operate both the cost side and the revenue side of Project Renew. We disagree with several of the assumptions in the HDG report. I think that the state of Connecticut user fee is misstated slightly. I think, as Tom suggested, the report does not give effect to the recently concluded collective bargaining agreements between the town and LIUNA and GMEA, which effectively provide for a 3-year period of salary increases in the 2 to 2.25% rate versus the 2.5% increase which we assumed in our long-range plan. For a number of reasons, I don't believe that Project Renew presents a $50 million problem for the town of Greenwich. I think the exclusion of the entire amount of Medicare revenues, some $36 million, I think, is not a realistic outcome. I'm also quite concerned that we will not have a decision by August 1st on what happens to Medicaid rates, but I don't have any special knowledge on that subject, but everything I read suggests that it could end up being later than that. I think, too, the 30-year projections which we have been asked to present implicate and illustrate the enormous effect of compounding, which exaggerates the slightest deviation from actual forecast. For example, our omission to increase the short-term resident variable expenses, which is a $1.8 million number in 2011, by the 3% inflation factor when carried out for the full 30 years, and ends up with the $31.7 million adjustment, which HDG identifies. It also permitted the conclusion, which in quickly looking at the handout tonight, I didn't see, but I did see at page 41 of the longer version that you've seen, the extraordinary conclusion that $50.7 million has to be generated through private donations to fund what is a $22.5 million construction project, and which I would like to propose or ask you to consider that if we had the opportunity to work collaboratively with HDG on a set of cash flow projections, possibly over a shorter period of time, as I think Leslie or as Ms. Tarkington suggested, that and maybe even a 20-year period, to some extent, you remove the drama of this tremendous effect of compounding on these numbers. And it also, I'd like to see a result which we could jointly endorse, that is both the Nathaniel Witherell Board and HDG, which I think would be in the long-term interests of advancing Project Renew. I would remind you that 10 years ago, when this exercise was done by a prior board of directors, some $2.5 million was spent on consulting fees, including HDG's fees, in order to get effectively where we are today. This board of directors has not spent a dime of the town's money on either our long-range plan and forecasts and obtaining the certificate of need from the state of Connecticut. And I can't help thinking we have come to the point where collaboration rather than confrontation would be a more productive or useful exercise than sort of being surprised by some of the conclusions in the HDG report. I would ask also that you not forget, as you deliberate over the future of Nathaniel Witherell, that we are being held to a far different standard than any other town capital improvement for which bonding authority is sought. And unlike our public schools, our Coscob remediation site, our asphalt projects, our fire and police facility projects, we are being tasked with repaying the debt from our results of operations. I think we're capable of that challenge, but I would ask you not to forget that the beneficiaries of this project are residents of Greenwich who, and some of the most vulnerable residents of Greenwich who deserve to live the remainder of their life in dignity and with respect. I think the board of Nathaniel Witherell would continue to hope to bring Project Renew to both your conclusion and the RTM's conclusion this year. I think waiting for more information from Washington that is not going to come soon, in my judgment, it simply delays the process. I think we're all going to have to look at the facts, imperfect as they may be, look at this board's record and make a decision on where we go with Project Renew. Thanks.
Thank you. As I've stated before, I know a lot of people have put a lot of time into Project Renew, dating back from the RTM Special Committee at that time. I know Mr. Huffman was on the RTM at that time and relative to that committee. And then even this board has taken it up and has spent hours listening, asking questions, meeting. So I don't think that there's anybody who doesn't want to get all the information and make an informed decision. And as people have heard me say throughout the budget process, this is probably the most important decision we'll be making, certainly over the next few months, but certainly over, I think, even the last year. And I thought it was even more important than the last budget that we decided, as that one was a one-year budget. This one has implications that will affect generations, literally, of this community. So to Nathaniel Witherell Board, thank you for being here again. It seems like you're going to be here almost every month with us until the end of this term. To HDG, again, thank you for coming here. We will make a decision at some point. That's a good thing for the citizens of the town. Maybe bad for HDG. We won't be needing your services, but we are going to work as to what else we're going to need. Despite Mr. Ormsby's comments, I do think that the beginning of January is probably the best time frame to schedule a meeting anyway, because by the time there's a whole cast of us that need to coordinate calendars. I know the RTM representatives are here and they're invited to attend all of those meetings. So by the time we get a calendar coordination to maximize number of people, within the first 10 days of August still seemed to me like the best time to meet. So again, we'll work through Peter Mynarski. He'll send out an email to everyone, or however he deals with the two of you, and then how that's then transmitted. In the meantime, I expect, as it happened in the past, for Nathaniel Witherell to talk with HTG about some of the assumptions, some of the things that need to be corrected, some of the things that you both agree on that can be corrected just almost superficially, so that everyone's working off the same numbers, and hopefully that communication can just continue on. Doesn't need to wait until this meeting that we have on this. But in any event, we'll look forward to that and that group meeting, and then having this come before. If any board member has a question before then, please let Mr. Raymer know, Ms. Tarkington, Mr. Simon, or myself know, and we'll follow up with a question to HTG. All right. Great. Thank you all again. So if that discussion wasn't meaty enough, we now come to our approval of our meeting minutes for June 20, 2011. Is there a motion to approve them?
So moved.
Moved by Ms. Tarkington. Second by Mr. Raymer. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Abstention. 11-0-1. Mr. Kelly abstains. Is there a motion to adjourn? So moved. Thanks.